Okay, so the topic for today, we're going to be talking about notifications in chapter 8.1. Before I get into that too quickly, I did want to kind of talk on one thing, and I know, Paul, you'd asked about this. When we're talking about, having these workers, which the workers, and notifications really go hand in hand, it's very rare that you're going to have a worker without a notification, or you're going to have a notification without a worker. Usually, those are entirely coupled, where the work that the work that you need to do in the background worker is going to trigger a notification, or the we need a notification to monitor what that worker is doing. So those things are very tightly coupled. One of the things you'd asked about workers is how do I do the communication back and forth? And if we kind of think about most of the stuff you've seen, it's very common for us to think of let's write a method or a function and say that function will do some work, and at the end of the day, it will return a value, right? And that's a kind of a common way that people think about writing functions. The problem with that, the problem with thinking in that space, is it doesn't really allow for threading or background work. Are you with me there?
No, I don't
So
get that.
the typical just trust me on that. The typical return doesn't work for that. Just saying I want to return something from a function doesn't work. Part of that is anytime you call a function, that function, the code that called that basically gets blocked. It can't run anymore until that function completes. And that's regardless of what language you're writing in, right? Until that function finishes, you can't go on. That's called synchronous. That's where we get the term synchronous coding. Okay?
Okay.
So typically we would expect the code to go from top to bottom. I call a function, I wait for its response, I get it back. But when we're dealing with these kind of things where the workers come in, what we really need is not synchronous code, we need asynchronous code. We need to be able to say, go do something, and maybe later you'll tell me that it's done, maybe not. That actually can be, that may or may not be something you need or want. So a lot of times you do want to maybe have some progress updates to, so maybe I'm 10% done, 20% done. Sometimes you want that, and sometimes it makes sense to build that out. And oftentimes you do want to know when it's done, but those aren't necessarily per se required. And so a lot of the work that we do in terms of basically all the work that we're going to do with workers is going to be in the space where it's you tell it to go do a thing, and then later something else happens, right? So the point is that the way that you return data from a worker is not through the function return. Does that make sense?
Now, yeah, I hear you. I've seen in some videos where
Mm-hmm.
there is a data object that's
Right.
created, and I
Yeah.
saw where you can put an int, you can put
Yes.
a string,
So
and
Paul,
pass that back as a
Paul.
as an argument. Yeah.
Yes, that exists. No, that won't work for what we're doing. So it's possible that you can construct a data object and return that as quote unquote part of the result. And that data is basically a bundle. There's two things about that. That data cannot hold very much data. I believe the limit, I think they said, is somewhere around 10K, 10 kilobytes. Um, and you really shouldn't be anywhere near that 10 kilobyte mark. So, what's acceptable to put into that data object is really less than 1 kilobyte. 1 kilobyte still ginormous. It's only meant to pass very, very small pieces of data through. So, thinking primitive types. You shouldn't be passing any object, you shouldn't be passing any lists that way. Okay.
So would you be passing some static string that represents a set of data? Is that how you do it?
So for our purposes, we won't be using it at all. Let me be clear about that. Like, we will not be using that mechanism of passing output data at all because it won't work for anything the things we're doing. Okay. So
Yeah.
that method exists, and one of the things they talked about is that you can chain your workers, where one worker's work depends on the work of the previous one, and in that case, when you're taking input from a previous worker, that's where that data is actually meant for. That data input and output is really meant for when you're chaining workers together, where one worker does something and then another worker does something. And so, in the case of what they were talking about chaining. Their specific example was, let's first blur the image or apply some sort of filter on it, then compress those images and then upload it. Well, okay, so those things are chained together, and because those different steps in the process depend on each other, okay, then the input and output mechanism works, and it's probably the right way of approaching things. That being said, it's still actually not even the whole picture. So, for instance, if I'm looking at that image processing thing, I actually still shouldn't put the image in the output data or the input data because it's too big, right? It's not unusual for your images, photos to be several megabytes in size. 20 megabytes is not an unusual size for a photo. Everybody with me there? So,
Yeah.
that's not data I can even add to the output. So what I actually add to the output is really just the path to the file. All I would put into that data object is the URI for the file that I'm working on. That would be all that would go through. It wouldn't be the actual image, it would just be where to find that image.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's just
Right?
a string, right?
Right.
That's what it comes
So,
down
like,
to.
if we're dealing with products, I would never want to put the product as part of that input or output data, but I could put the product ID. Does that follow?
Yeah.
So what that means is I can put a small amount of data there, but most of the data is communicated through a different channel.
I'd
Okay.
have to see what that is. When I
Okay.
see these workers here, I look at
Mm-hmm.
do work,
Mm-hmm.
and I ask myself,
Mm-hmm.
what does that mean? And
Mm-hmm.
I look at what am I trying to do? All right, with
Mm-hmm.
my weather app, right? I'm tapping into an API.
Right.
Right. So I need to establish a connection,
Mm-hmm.
and I need to link up to it and pull the data down and pass it. And
No,
to
no, no.
me,
Hold up.
no,
Hold up. So
no.
you need to connect to the internet. Yes. So you're connecting, and talking about this more generally. You're connecting to the API. You're downloading that response. You're parsing it as JSON. Those three parts, yes, that's happening in the worker. That's the end of your worker, pretty much. Your worker, like the passing the data, um, is not the primary work of the worker. Yes, you need to do something in that regard, but that's not the primary job, right? Once you've passed the data, your worker's done. Okay. Once you've
Uh,
sent the data out, your worker's job is never to update the UI. Okay. It's
right.
only to allow the app to know, here's the data that I got, and having it. So last week we did go through the prime numbers example and talking about how to do that with background workers. I used two different tools. I showed you two different tools of how to do that communication. So the two tools that I went over is, first of all, was local broadcasts. Okay. And the second one was live data. Both of those can be used. Local broadcasts and live data are both things that can be used to communicate data from the worker to other parts of the application. Okay? So local broadcasts and live data are the two things you need to understand for that communication.
Right. Okay. I
Okay.
don't want to derail the lecture here, but I don't understand how to do that without passing in
Well,
parameters.
look at again. We did this last week. So if you look at the prime numbers code along one, we did that with local broadcasts. If you look at prime numbers code along two, we did that with live data. Both of
Okay.
those techniques work. It doesn't matter what the background work is. It doesn't matter if you're connecting to the internet or if you're connecting to a database or you're connecting to Firebase or whatever you're doing in the background. That really doesn't matter. That's not the big deal in terms of figuring out how to do the worker and the data passing. So the way you pass the data is pretty much always, it's just basically going to be those two. And those are the only two mechanisms that you should use. The only two mechanisms that you should use for passing data are local broadcasts and live data. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I guess once I see one example, I'll get it. It's
Yeah.
just a little murky at first because we start with the
Mm-hmm.
do work and then we get into the live data later. And
Right.
while you're going through the
Mm-hmm.
video, it's like, well, I have an input of a city, state, and country. Where
Right.
does that factor in? Because I don't
Right.
have that. Yeah, it's not a
Listen,
prime number
Paul.
where you
Paul.
started.
So when you finish parsing the data, right, you've got it into an object, right? So let's say you've got a city object or you've got a response object, whatever. Once you get to the point where you've got the data parsed, right? You took the JSON, you parsed it. That's where you then put it into. That's where then you connect with live data. That's where you're gonna say, hey, here I want to post a value to this live data object, and it's going to be seen on the other side, right?
Within do work.
Right. Within do work, you're going to say, call a method on your data source. That's going to do the update. The UI is then going to respond to that update. So it's through the data source, which is the owner of the live data. So basically, the gist is with local broadcasts. So one of the things with local broadcasts, you're only going to see them as long as you're listening to them, which is a good and bad thing. It's good for things where you only want something to happen right at the time where the worker did the thing, right? So if you only want it to happen right at a specific time, then broadcasts are great, and you only want to have ever happen at once, then great. Local broadcasts are good for events like that. But what is more often the case is you want to save some data and then have it be able to, you can reference it like 5-10 different times down in the future. So live data provides a better way for you to track that and keep it and query it later, if that makes sense, right? So like if I were to say, when we finish getting all the primes, I'm just going to send that whole list, right? Well, anybody that's listening at that time will get that broadcast. But if you weren't there listening at the time, then you've missed all of the work. Versus if I put it into a live data object, I can come back to it 10, 100 times, days later, and it will still be there, kind of thing.
So live data is head and shoulders. It's the best.
It's usually the thing you use.
Yeah. We
It's
don't need
usually the
local
thing you
broadcast
use.
manager is kind of when would you want to do that?
Again, it's when you have a specific events where it's just at this point, this moment in time, this occurred. So that happens. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily, and I'm sure you're going to occur. There's a very good chance that you'll run into it in, one of the things that we end up building or here or not. But the one you want to understand the most is the live data, because that's the most of the time. Live data is the one you want. Okay.
Okay.
So
All right.
most of the time, live data is going to be the one that we use. Local broadcasts is a little bit older. Local broadcasts was introduced several years back I don't remember exactly what year at this point, but it's probably about 5 years old at this point. Live data is much newer than that. Live data is probably 3-ish years old, roughly, and it's part of that newer Jetpack framework. So that's the other kind of picture, is that live data is a newer system, local broadcast is an older system, and so we're seeing this shift where we have new things come in, and sometimes those new things just replace the need for the older thing, or do that thing better. Whereas, the other things like local broadcast still stick around because occasionally there's some edge cases where it's still the right thing. Does that make sense? And that's pretty much the truth with almost everything in Android. Work Manager does things really, really well, and most of the time it's the one you want. But it doesn't actually do everything. So there are cases where you may need to fall back to some of the other tools. Cool.
Yeah, I'm gonna need some initial hand holding for this
Yeah.
lab with this. I mean, I get it, but then I've
Again,
seen
the
the
thing I
primes.
would the thing I would say, go back and look at the primes code along that we did, specifically primes code along 2, and take a very close look at how we did it. Okay, don't assume that don't make the assumption that just because it's not using the network that it doesn't apply. In fact, it's very close. What we're doing in the Prime Numbers app is very close to what you need to do for your lab assignment.
Okay, I mean, I'll take a look at it. I just feel like just a nudge is what I need to get over, and then the light bulb will come on.
Yeah. Okay. So let's actually get into the question of notifications. So I'm gonna do it off of the reading assignment today, and I did see that a few people have had a chance to read through it and put some comments in there. So I'll try to hit those things as I go through. If I miss something that you had a question about, then please just ask me here, and I'll try to get to that and answer that in this lecture. Okay. So first of all, first question to ask is, well, what is a notification? So a notification is something that appears at the top of your screen, and it appears basically outside of an app's UI. So like normally what we've been coding up until this point, all of the UI that we've been working with has been in the concept of like an activity. Activity is your root layer, and that's where all of your content and your controls has to go inside of an activity. The notifications appear outside of your activity, and I'm sure you've seen these a lot. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with most of this, but basically they appear at the top of your screen, showing you that you have something there, something that occurred. And often these are used as a way to tell you about things that are happening when you're not in the application. So even if I don't have the application open, even if I'm doing something else, I can get a notification that tells me about something going on. So that could be that somebody liked your photo on Instagram. That could be somebody posted a new tweet on Twitter. That could be a comment that somebody posted on Facebook. It could be a lot of different things. It could be another case you might see is okay, Google, maybe you're in the process of uploading or downloading files. You might see a notification, as long as that's running, to inform you that, hey, you're uploading this or you're downloading that, and maybe give you a way to cancel it or see kind of the progress there. You'll also see this for like shipping notifications, right? Your item's been shipped, it's been delivered. So you're going to see a lot of these. There's a few different ways that this can show up. Commonly, what you'll see is, kind of an icon up at the top of the screen that tells you there's a notification there. When the actual notification occurs, it might make a sound, it might not make a sound. You have that flexibility. You can have the notification appear up with a sound or not with a sound, and that's kind of on a per notification basis. You can decide how to configure that. At least in Android 8.0 or higher. You may also see the notification potentially pop out when it occurs up at the top of the screen that may say, here's what happened. So there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different configurations that you'll see when we talk about notifications. So it can be either what we call a low importance notification, where it doesn't obstruct the user very much. You don't get much notice about it. Or it can be a very high importance, which means that it shows up, blocks part of the screen, part of the top of the screen, and it also makes a sound, and it also will put the icon there. So there's several levels of how important is the notification and how much priority, how much should it disturb the user when it occurs. Pretty much every app we build will have a notification of some form or have notifications of some form because large in part, one of the biggest ways that we use these for is to bring users back into our applications. So let's say your user installs your app and then, okay, so they're using it and then maybe they stop using it for a week or two, right? Well, without notifications, you have no way of encouraging them to come back, right? Which means that your app just basically is going to fall into disuse and eventually they're going to delete it. Or just leave it installed on their phone forever and they'll forget that it's there. So notifications are really important from a business perspective because they help drive business back to your application. Okay? They also mean that you don't necessarily have to be constantly checking the app itself and refreshing to see if there's new stuff or there's new posts. It gives you a way to know about that when it happens. Okay. Questions, notifications?
Why is low notification? Isn't that the same as no notification?
It's not the same as no notification.
Okay, because it doesn't show up, it doesn't make a sound. To me, it's like, then what does it do?
We'll get there. It will get there.
Okay.
Let's talk about that when we get to the importance levels. So, for instance, just asking from your own kind of experience with Android, what is maybe probably the most common thing that you get a notification for and is helpful for you? This is for the class.
About a bank deposit, perhaps.
Okay. Text email.
Message,
Mm-hmm.
or like a phone call.
It's like when you get a text, then you get a notification.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Anything else?
You can get a notification for email.
Okay. Yep, that's true. What's probably to flip it on its head, what's probably the least helpful thing that you frequently get notified about?
Advertisements.
That happens too. Yep, fat advertisements sometimes. Facebook's definitely one of those which is like, maybe sometimes it's helpful, but most of the time it's just annoying. At least has been my experience. But yeah. There's definitely this middle ground of learning how to send the right amount of notifications, but not too many. And one of the things you'll honestly find is that one strategy is not going to work the same for all users. Like if you pick a strategy and say here's where we're going to send notifications, that will work for some that may work for some users, but it's never going to work for all. So notifications inherently need to be configurable, right? There needs to be a way for the users to determine how important certain notifications are and whether or not they care about those notifications or not. That's definitely a must. There's been a lot of dark patterns, evil patterns in a lot of the Android marketplace where they're just kind of like notifications are all on by default and they make noise and they're as obtrusive as possible. And the reality is, for most users, they really don't want a lot of notifications. They want some, but they don't want a lot. So, it's something that's really, really important, and there's a lot more to it than just writing the code. The code is one part of this, but the actual user experience and how frequently it occurs and how all of that is tremendously important. The other thing that matters there is oftentimes notifications come with a certain amount of battery drain. Because in order to implement those, you have to have some code running in order to see if there's something that they need to be notified about. So inherently, almost everything that you do with notifications is also going to drain the battery pretty close to constantly, right? So you do have to be careful and mindful of what you're doing there and how you're impacting the user's battery. Okay? So that's one of the reasons that you'll see Work Manager be used heavily in regards to notifications, because Work Manager, as we saw in the video last week, as we saw in the talk last week, does a really good job of paying attention to a lot of the battery saving things that have been put in Android in recent years. Whether it be doze mode, whether it be checking whether or not the device is connected to the internet or the state of the antenna, the current state of the battery, all of those kind of things. Work Manager is very good at helping you schedule things in such a way that it reduces your battery drain. So it's really helpful for that. There's a lot of hardware specifics on what causes battery drain and how to minimize it, and you can dive very deeply into that. But the long and short of it is, if you use Work Manager, it will take care of a lot of those things for you. Okay?
Yep.
So, first of all, there's a few different ways for the notification to appear. One of the newer ways to appear is what we call here the notification dot, or they call it the app icon badge. If you see this little dot here, that says that there is a notification that is currently active. That says that there's at least one notification that is currently active for that application. So you'll see this in your list of apps. You'll see this on your home screen as you're swiping through. So here we see Gmail has a notification. Here we say that the Play Store has a notification. So that's one of the things that's built into newer versions of Android. Older versions of Android did not actually have this. So that's you'll see the notification dot in a few places. So it is possible also, as I kind of mentioned here, in newer devices, from the dot directly you can actually go and see it. And I think they just they just do a long press and this menu sort of thing will pop up. So you can actually see the notification that way, rather than going to the system bar at the top. I don't know that too many users use that, but it is something that's available there and sometimes is more convenient. So the next thing to talk about, in terms of actually getting into the code, is Android's been able to do notifications basically from inception. Every Android device out there on the market can do notifications in some way, shape, or form. But the rules and the way you set them up and different restrictions on those notifications have changed over time. There's been a lot of features and a lot of building around notifications because, well, Android recognizes that as being a very, very important part of the platform. to the point where it's a major part of most applications business, is what happens with notifications. So in terms of originally when notifications were released, there was very little control for users to actually change how those notifications appeared. You didn't really have structures around, like, well, what if I don't want it to check the internet every 15 minutes? What if I only want it to do it every 2 hours? What if I don't want the notification to make sound? What if I don't want to pop it on screen, or I don't want to see the notification icon up at the top? Maybe I don't want to see that. Maybe I don't want to see the notification dot. Those are all things that the users honestly have preferences around. But originally, there was none of that. Originally, all of that had to be done in the actual application. And so if the application provided that configuration, you could do it. If the application didn't provide that configuration, you were up the creek without a paddle. Right? So if the app decided, well, I want to check the internet every 15 minutes, and I'm going to show you a notification that makes sounds every time, tough luck, right? That used to be the world of Android. Or you had the options of turning off all the notifications for an app, or turning them all on. There's just, the strictly off and on. That was kind of the early days of this. And so we're talking pre 8.0. There was very little ability for your users to actually configure this. So you really had to build your own interface for it. Okay? So the common way that we used to do this, building our own systems, we would use the settings APIs, the Android settings APIs, which those are actually covered in lessons 9.1 and 9.2. So that used to be the way that we would set up notifications and configure them, is through the settings and the preferences APIs. Because a lot of apps were very poorly behaved and didn't give the users a lot of flexibility there, plus because the applications had to actually choose to spend time in building those out, which a lot of times they didn't, Android kind of finally stepped in with 8.0 and said, okay, you have to give your users a way to configure things. And we will provide that through the operating system instead of you providing it through your app. Is everybody with me there?
Yeah.
So notification channels come in with 8.0. There are now the way that we configure, users can configure the notifications to their heart's content. And it actually allows you to do almost everything you want with configuring the notifications the way that makes sense for you. There's still some gaps, I think, in the notification channel system. Basically, one of those is that you can't control the interval. So if I want to say that this should only happen every 2 hours instead of 15 minutes, I still can't do that by configuring the notification channels. That's still one of those things that you have to configure in the application. So that interval is still something that's not configurable through here. Another thing that's not configurable is how these are kind of grouped together. So if you say, I'm only going to build, my app only has one notification channel, and everything goes to that channel, then the user is still stuck in the boat of it's all or nothing. If you only have one channel, the configuration can be done just on that channel. So they can either decide, I want all the notifications, or I want none of the notifications, or somewhere in between. So in reality, most apps are going to have more than one notification channel. And so that's to give the user different ways to configure it. So they can say, these type of notifications are one way, these type of notifications are another way, third kind of notifications are another way. Another thing it doesn't do, and you kind of can play around with it and build something yourself, but it doesn't really have it built in and doesn't have great support for it, is let's say I want to do notifications for like Facebook groups, right? And so let's say I'm part of 5 different Facebook groups. what's the odds that I want to have different notification settings for each of those groups?
Very high.
Very high. Let's say, what about I'm in 20 different servers in Discord? I probably don't want to have the same settings for all of those 20 servers, right? I probably don't want to get notifications from all of them. So I want to be able to change things on a per server basis. That's still not something that the notification channels does great. Because it's the notification channels, at least the way they're built, they're largely meant to be fixed in place. So you have your 5, 10, 20 different notification channels. Those shouldn't change based on what groups you're in. So, well, you can implement systems with that. It's not really meant for that. Okay?
Right.
So there's still some gotchas there. Okay. So the way that you configure a notification channel today is going to be through the settings app. And so if you go into the settings app on 8.0 or later, you're going to see something similar to this screen. So if I go to the app, there's a notification button, and here I can see a few different things. So first of all, you can see that there's this allow notification dot slider, right? So users can turn that off and on. If they turn that on, then it will show that notification dot on the badge, or it will turn it off. Or you can turn it off. I believe that's typically set on by default. Okay, so but that's an option there. Then beneath that, you have all these. It's listed under categories. See, there's a bunch of different things here. So firing alarms and timers, missed alarms, stopwatch timers, upcoming alarms. So they've got like 5 different options here, 5 different categories. Okay, and you'll see that they have a switch with them. So everybody see that switch? So that switch is to say if I flip it off, I never get notifications on that category. If I switch it on, then I am going to get your notifications on that category. You'll also see some text under here. So this says make sound and pop up screen, make sound, make sound, make sound. So there's some additional configuration that you can do. So these, what we're seeing as categories here, each of these 5 categories are actually in the developer terminology. Those categories are notification channels. Those are what we call notification channels, and that's how we're going to set them up in code. Okay, so we don't actually call them categories, we call them channels. So in here we can have different settings, right? So these can have certain settings, these can have certain settings, these can have certain settings. If you click on any one of those instead of clicking the switch, you're going to be taken to this screen where you get to configure that channel to your heart's whim. So you can see a few different things. You can see that you have an importance that you can switch up or down. You've got the sound. You can determine to have a sound or not to have a sound, and you can actually change what that sound that it plays is. So for instance, for each of these different 5 categories, each of these different 5 channels, I could have a different sound, so I know what kind of notification it is. I can also tell it to vibrate or not vibrate. That's up to you. The notification dot, you'll see there's a global setting, but there's also a specific setting on a per channel basis. Blink light, that works on some devices. Some devices have like a blue notification light on the front usually. Sometimes they're on the back, but that notification light, basically the idea is it blinks if there is a notification that you haven't looked at. So if you turn that on, if that's set to true, then that light will be blinking to tell the user that there's a notification, and they can then turn on their screen and look at it. There's also a pretty important one down here on the lock screen that can be turned off or on. If it's turned on, then you do see that notification without logging into the device. Otherwise, you have to actually open the device to see the notification. That's pretty important from a privacy standpoint. And then there's also override do not disturb. Do not disturb is basically kind of a way of saying, hey, I don't want to hear any notifications. I'm busy doing something. But you can actually tell notifications to be able to get past that if you would say, well, if I've got an emergency call from a family member, maybe I want to hear that notification anyway, even though I'm on do not disturb. So there's a lot of configuration you can see here on a channel by channel basis that didn't exist prior to 8.0. Okay. Any questions so far on this stuff?
Well, it's pretty straightforward.
Okay. So again, what you see there is listed as categories in the UI is actually channels in the code. One thing was noted here, if your app targets 8.0 or higher, it says you must implement one or more notification channels. That's actually I think that's slightly misworded. What they really meant to say is in order to send notifications, you must implement one or more notification channels. So nowadays in 8.0 or later, you can't send a notification at all unless you're sending it to a channel. Does that make sense? But you can definitely write apps that don't have notification channels. We've been doing that all semester. Does that make sense? That's what they mean by that. Is in order to send a notification, you have to have a channel. Cool?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, yeah. Anything lower than that, then yeah, that becomes a little bit harder if you're dealing with pre 8.0. Then you may need to provide your own interface in terms of settings to change and configure the notifications, but we won't go over that this semester. So in terms of creating a notification channel, again, because notification channels were only introduced in 8.0 or API 26, we can't actually do anything with notification channels on anything lower than that. So a lot of this code will need to be prefixed by a check. Here say build version SDK int. Remember, that's the version of the device. So that gives us a number from, in our case, between 21 and 30. That'll tell us what we're currently running on. And we're just going to say if that's greater than or equal to 26, which is Oreo, which is O is short for, that's greater than or equal to 26, then we can proceed with the code that we're writing. I do actually hard code in the number 26 here because I don't find that constant is at all useful. I find it's actually a negative in terms of readability to go back to the code rather than just saying 26. So I just literally write that number there. So we construct a notification channel. So here they're doing new notification channel. That notification channel, when you construct it, requires 3 parameters. The first parameter is the ID of the channel, which is a numeric. Actually, I think, no, it's a text. It's a string, if I remember right. So that has to be unique within your application. Several apps can have the same channel ID, so you don't have to worry about putting like your package name in there. But you do have to have a unique channel ID for each channel that you have. And then you next have a name for the channel. Here they say mascot notification. That is the name that users see. So for instance, if I'm looking here, firing alarms and timers, that's the name of the notification channel. So that's where we're going to see that appear. So that means that the channel ID, something that users don't see, we don't translate that, but we do need to translate this string here. Is everybody with me there? So this is one thing we do need to extract to strings XML versus the channel ID we don't want to extract. The third argument then is what we call the importance. And the importance is kind of a scale saying how important, quote unquote, important the notification is. And that changes how obtrusive it is. So the higher that number is, the more obtrusive it will be. The less it is, the less obtrusive, the lower it is, the less obtrusive it will be. So it's a question of how much, by default, do you want that notification to interrupt the user. And so that importance is going to change the default settings here on this screen under the notification category. Now, all of this is configurable as of 8.0. All of these things can be changed by the user. So you're just trying to pick a good default that will work for most users with the recognition that users are going to be able to change it. And they should be able to change it. So what you're picking oftentimes is going to be somewhere in the middle ground, probably not as loud as you would like it to be as a default, is probably going to be a step beneath there. And so this, what we're calling importance default, is kind of a middle level importance. It's not the highest importance, it's not the lowest importance. And it's worth noting that, as you're building these channels out, you probably you're generally going to have an app with more than one channel. It's usually it's normal that let's say you have 5 channels. One of those is probably going to be of high importance. 3 of those are going to be of middle or default importance, and another one of those is going to probably be low importance. So you're usually going to have things that fall both on the high end of the spectrum as well as things that should follow in the low end of the spectrum. And again, it really matters on how much you want to interrupt the user. I will say that you should definitely weigh the frequency of the notification in your decision on the importance. So if it's a very, very frequent, the more frequent the notification is, the lower priority it should be. So if it happens once every 15 minutes, it should be very, very low on the priority list. Versus if it happens once every week, then it should be very high. Okay? Is everybody with me there?
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely a sweet spot in there.
Yeah. So it should be higher based on how frequent it is. How infrequent it is. If it's a rare, then it needs to be more important. If it's very, very common, then it should be lower importance. Okay. So here, when we're talking about notifications, there are a few different importance levels. And so here they say there are 5 importance levels, none being the lowest one, or 0, up to 4 being the highest one. This gets kind of odd because prior to 8.0, Android had actually introduced something called priority, which is very similar in scale, but different. So it's also a scale. I believe it's more. I'll have to look at it here, but it's not 4 levels, but it existed in the system before that. Difference being the notification, like the importance of a notification, is set on a per channel basis. The priority of a notification is set on a per notification basis. It's not set per the channel. It's set when you actually send the notification. So that's one of the things you have to be kind of watchful for. If you're dealing with devices before 26, then you have to use the priority. And if you're dealing with after 26, then you're dealing with importance. They have a lot in common. The difference is priorities were not configurable by your users. So let's look a little bit about what that is. So in terms of the notifications, the different priority levels in Android, the highest one that you can get for importance, again, we're kind of talking about notification channels here. Importance high, which is one of the constants we can use, says that these are urgent. So those are notifications that make a sound and appear as a heads-up notification. Those are the most loud. That's what you get if you mark it as high. It's going to be marked as urgent. The next level beneath that, which is what we call default, is notifications that make a sound, and you do get the notification up at the top, the little symbol. So that's kind of the default level if you just use default. The next level beneath that is medium, which does appear in your notification bar and does enable the notification light, but it doesn't make a sound. That's the only difference between this default and this low, is the default makes a sound, low doesn't make a sound. The next level beneath that is minimum. I think that honestly that them calling this default is really a major misnomer, because for a lot of cases, this level, this high level, is not a good default for a lot of users. I would say that I wish that honestly that they had chosen this one, medium, as the quote-unquote default, because I will say for most things, that is a better default, is to not make sound.
Maybe my coffee hasn't kicked in yet, but I'm looking at that chart and thinking it wouldn't be too hard to do better than what they have up there as far as making it logical.
Yeah, in terms of making it logical. Yeah.
Yeah, like a low is a min, but a medium is a low.
Yeah, exactly.
And a high isn't a high. Nothing is what it's labeled to be.
Exactly, right. And so these levels, urgent, high, medium, and low, that's what the user sees here. Urgent, etc. That's the level that they actually see in the settings app. But here's what they call it in code. This should have been urgent, high, medium, low. I do not understand why they use different names than what they use on the UI, but that's what they decided to do. Priorities, similar kind of thing. They are named basically the same way: priority high, priority default, priority low, priority min. Again, the only difference is that priorities are set on a per notification basis, not on a per channel basis. Which meant that, in 7.1 you could do kind of one-off notifications, and that's less so in 8.0. So in terms of configuring the initial settings of the notification channel, remember the first thing we had to do was construct it. So we had to construct it with a ID, a name, and a importance. Few things we can add to that. One of those is the description. So, and you generally should always put a description on your channels, because the name by itself is usually not enough to tell the user what does that really mean? What kind of notifications fit into that group, into that category? So I would say hands down, every channel that you create should have a description, and it should be longer, give some more information than what's there. So the description's important. The description also, just like the name, does need to be translated because you want the user to see it in their native language. So if it's in Spanish, it should be in Spanish. If it's in Chinese, it should be in Chinese, etc., etc., etc. So make sure you put translated versions in there. Enable vibration. You can turn that off and on by default. You can set the light color for the notification light. So here you're saying enable lights. That's the notification blinker, and you can make it red or blue. I forget what the other options are in there. Generally speaking, you don't mess with this. Generally speaking, most apps you're not going to want to mess with the light color, because the users usually have an expectation about what that color should be. So in terms of creating the notification channel, so we constructed it, we configured it. We also have to register it with what we call the notification manager. So the way you get the notification manager, you're going to say get system service, call context.notification service. You'll remember this is kind of the same way that we've done a few other services, such as like the connectivity manager. So we get those as system services. And so we're going to save that real quick here, and then we're going to say, okay, let's create the notification channel. So we actually have to call this method tell the operating system to create it. So the place that we're typically going to see all of this code and where you should put all this code is in your application class. So inside of the application class, through the onCreate, that's where we want to create all of these channels. We want to create them at application startup. Okay, so all of this code we've talked about so far should be in the application class. One of the things that you'll see I've seen this in a lot of examples for notifications. A lot of examples will wait to create that channel until they're actually in the worker. Like they'll have the worker create the channel. You don't want to do that because until the channel's created, the user can't configure it. So if you postpone that create channel and put it other places, not in the application class, then users won't be able to configure it until that notification actually appears. Which is which might seem like a minor thing, is a really major deal for users. So you want to make sure you create all of your notification channels up at the front. Questions?
It doesn't sound like it takes that much code, honestly.
It doesn't. It really doesn't. We'll look at it, but it's, with inside the if statement, it's usually 5-ish lines of code-ish to create the channels. It's usually not a big deal.
And then in the worker, right? That's where the notifications will be sent.
Yeah, and then you have to do the stuff in the worker to actually send the notifications. That usually, I will say that both of those things do end up being big enough that I usually break those off into separate functions. So I usually have a function to create a notification, to create the notification channels, as well as I have a function to send a notification, because it usually requires enough code that it doesn't make sense to just embed all that in do worker on create. So I usually break those off into separate functions. But it's not really all that much code as far as what we're talking about today. So in terms of building up the notification, you can build notifications directly by just saying new notification, but you shouldn't. You should always use the notification compat builder instead. And the reason for that is that there's been so many different changes from early days of, talking about Android 14. I think API 14 is one of the first ones that saw, notifications. If we want to go all the way back, we'll go from 14 all the way up to 30. There's a lot of gotchas in terms of working with notifications. So you want to make sure that you're working with the notification compat classes, because that will hide a lot of those weird and solve a lot of those weird complexities that have occurred over time because of all the changes that we've done. Not all of them, but we'll take care of most of them. Again, because there's a lot of things that they've changed in this area. So we're going to use the notification compat builder. That's going to start the process of building out a notification. In order to start that, you need both a context and the channel ID that you're going to send it to. So that's the first two pieces of data we have to pass in, is the context and the ID of the notification channel. On API 26 or higher, it'll use that notification channel as the destination for your notification. On any lower APIs, if it's less than 26, it will just ignore that channel ID. And so that's one of the benefits of using the notification compat class. It'll automatically figure that out for you. So in terms of setting the notification contents, there's a few different parts to the notification. So for instance, here we've got the icon that appears. Here it's saying the app and at what time, how long ago did it appear. There's also the title, and then there's what we call the text. So to configure this icon here, we're going to call set small icon. To configure this, we set content title, and set this one, we say set content text. So those options are completely configurable. You can call whichever of those you want or don't want. I think that usually those three parts are always required. So usually I'm going to put that in there as, here's a notification, here's an icon, here's my title, here's my text. And remember, because these things are translate, because these things are being shown to the user, you want to make sure that the content title and the content text are in the user's language. So you always want to make sure that these are extracted as well. So you'll make sure that those two strings are translated as well. Which will be a little bit interesting because the context is not as readily available in your workers as it is in an activity. But we'll look through that. It's not a very hard thing to change. It's just you have to recognize that it takes there's a little bit, the code looks a little bit different because it's going to be in a worker instead of an activity. So those are the things that you kind of typically need to set: the icon, the title, and the text. The rest of the things, there's a bunch of other things that you can set, but the rest are optional. So one of those things you should set usually is the priority to be consistent and work with Android 7.1 devices. So we're usually going to set that in there as well. And then it's also possible to have the notification do something when the user taps on it. It's not required. You can have the notification just be there, and when the user taps on it, nothing happens. But oftentimes we want something to occur. And what occurs when they tap on it can be a broad variety of things. It really depends on what you're doing to determine what should be the default. The most common thing to do when you tap on the notification is for it to launch an activity. So for instance, you may click on that notification. It may take you to the main activity of your app. Or it might be, maybe it's a notification about an email that you received. Well, I would want to tap on that notification. It would want to then show me the contents of the email. So my intent that I built up there would be, to show the email detailed activity with maybe the ID of the email would be in there as an extra. Now, it's worth noting you can't give intents directly to the notification. So we have to actually put a wrapper around the notification called a pending intent. So a pending intent is basically an intent that can be fired later. That's not fired immediately, it's fired later. So we actually need to in order to set up what happens when you tap on the notification, first thing you got to do is create the intent itself, and then you wrap it up in a pending intent, and then that pending intent you give to the notification. That does usually end up with a few lines of code to do that because of all the different objects involved. So pending intent, there's a few different static methods on there that you can use to get different kinds of intents. So for instance, if we want an intent that starts an activity, we're going to call pending intent get activity. If we want a pending intent that starts a service, then we're going to call pending intent get service. If we want one that sends a broadcast, then it's going to be pending intent get broadcast. Of those three, the only one we will be using this semester is this one, pending intent get activity, because we kind of talked about with other things this past week or two, services and broadcasts are not as common as they used to be. So these we won't see as much. We'll see this more commonly. Each of these pending methods take different arguments. Okay, so in order to create a pending intent, you need a context, you need an integer, and this is what we call the request code. Now that term request code, you've heard that before. Remember that when we talked about working with activities, this actually goes all the way back to lesson 2.1-ish. We talked about doing the start activity for result and then doing the on activity result. Do you remember that? Between sending data back and forth. So this request code that we're talking about here, that goes to on activity result. Okay. Questions?
Nothing yet till we get to the code, probably.
So everybody remember what I'm kind of talking about there, the on activity result?
It's start activity for result, right?
Yeah, start activity for result, and then the callback is on activity result.
Okay, yeah.
So this request gets delivered to on activity result. So you've got the request code, you've got an intent that you want to be delivered, you've got some flags for the pending intent, and those flags are honestly pretty weird and not documented very well. I have still not found a good explanation of what those flags actually do. I have seen pretty much every example I've seen either puts 0 as no flags or they put flag update current. I've really only seen those two options, and I haven't seen a significant difference to them. I will say from what I've read, it seems like flag update current is the only one you ever want to use, so I don't really understand why those flags exist. So that's what I'm going to put as the fourth argument all the time, is pending intent flag update current. I'm sure there's a reason for some of the other flags, but again, I haven't really found a lot of explanation of why you'd want to use them other than that one. You can also, if you want to, again, this is only on newer versions of Android. On newer versions of Android, you can add these action buttons. The way that we set the first pending intent, we're going to call the notification builder, say set content intent, pass in that pending intent. So that's what happens when you click on the main body, say here. But you can also add buttons here. And so these can be like here they've got a learn more action, or here they've got an update action. Those aren't required. You don't have to have actions. Most notifications don't. And there's also a hard limit that you should generally not have more than 2. You can on larger screens have 3, but 2 is usually where you should stop adding more. So you want to be, if you do need them, it's going to be something that's not the default action, but there also shouldn't be very many of them. That kind of comes down to material design, is where they kind of document how many should be there. But 2 is kind of the max that you're supposed to do from a UX perspective. So in terms of creating those, both of these require pending intents. So if we're going to set this up, we're going to have a pending intent for the content. We're going to have a pending intent for learn more. We're also going to have a pending intent for update. So just like we had talked about, those are, you generally start with building an intent out, wrapping it in a pending intent, and then giving it here. So to add those action buttons, you're going to call the notification builder. You're going to say add action. You need to provide 3 arguments. The first one is a icon, so you can give it an icon here. Next is some text. That text should be translated. So here they've got car as the icon, get directions, and then they've got some pending intent, which is what's going to happen when you actually click on it. So that's how you add an action. You just call add action. Again, you typically want to limit that to 2 actions at most. It's also worth noting here, so this first argument, which is the icon, starting from Android 7.0, those action icons don't appear anymore. So it used to be that icon would be right here next to the text. As of 7.0, those don't exist anymore. So it actually really doesn't matter what you pass here as the icon. Cool.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So that's there. It really doesn't matter a lot what icon you put there. It's also possible to make more complex notifications. We call them expandable notifications. And it says, as it says here, these were introduced in Android 4.1. They request that you use them sparingly because they do take up more space and such. But they're for a broad variety of things. Yes, you should use them sparingly, but you should absolutely use them because they do make your notifications look a whole lot better. Now, to use these, you need to provide a style, and we're gonna use the set style method to do that. There's a few out-of-the-box styles that you can use. One of them is big text style that says for larger format notifications that include a lot of text. So if you're using the regular notification format, you're limited to say maybe 80-ish characters. Probably I would say less than that. But you're limited to a very small number of characters that you can have as the notification text. If, on the other hand, I'm giving you a notification about an email, and I want to put the full contents of the email, or it's a text message, I want to put the full contents of the text message, this is where I need to use that big text style. And so that will let me put more text in there where it's spread across multiple lines. Because the regular style just is a small blurb. So this gets used all the time when you're talking about messages and social networks, any place where you can send messages between people. This big text style is very common. There's also this inbox style for displaying a summary lines. This is used for things like Gmail, where it will, in a single notification, you can see a list of all your recent notifications. So that's what that does. It groups a bunch of notifications together into a single notification. So that's also something you should absolutely use if you're getting frequent notifications. That's worth considering. There's also media style. This is for playback. Namely for this is if you're building a media player. So the media style adds buttons like stop, start, and pause that you can click directly. You can use those actions directly from the notification. And I can't remember if those show icons anymore or not. I think that they might have gotten converted back over to text with 7.0. But yeah, so that's if you have a media player. Media players are the only ones that really use this. Messaging style. This would be if you have an ongoing conversation. This is puts that together. The messaging style and the inbox style are very, very similar. Inbox style is more designed for emails. This would be more like if you've got a Snapchat conversation that's going, then you could put all of those in this and in a conversation. But those are very, very similar. There's also finally the big picture style. And so this can show you a large format. This can show you the whole picture. So if you, for every reason, need to embed an actual image into the notification, that's what you use, is the big picture style. So that's all optional. You don't have to provide any of these expanded styles. And as they say, you should use them sparingly. But they are absolutely helpful in terms of making your notification more noticeable, as well as potentially more useful, because you can put more content into it. So the way that fits in, let's say we're building up our notification. In here, we're going to say set style, big picture. So we construct a new big picture style. Here they're giving it an image, and here they're giving it some text. So that's all that's needed to switch to one of those, like the big picture style. If I remember right, there's a little bit more needed for the messaging style and the inbox style, but that's basically the general pattern to it, is you just add a style object. In terms of, sometimes you'll have these ongoing notifications. An ongoing notification is something that the user can't dismiss. And it informs the user about something that's currently happening. So for instance, with our Primes app, we might use an ongoing notification to say, hey, I'm still working, I'm still looking for prime numbers. Or if you're downloading a file, you might see an ongoing notification that says, hey, I'm still in the process of downloading it. Or if you're uploading a file, same kind of thing. You might see a notification as that works that's going to inform you that that's occurring. For a while here, you would see these a lot for things like locations, because they would use that to say, hey, I'm currently looking at your location, so I need to show an ongoing notification to say, hey, I'm doing that. This ongoing notification, you get it by, you say set ongoing true. part of the reason for it is that there's some newer restrictions. I think they were introduced in 8.0 and later around services and things running in the background. So by default, currently if you leave your application, you close it, that app then goes what we call into the background, which means it can't be running any code. So using a ongoing notification makes your app, even if it's not necessarily on screen, it means that the app is running in the quote-unquote foreground. So these ongoing notifications also change the state of your app from a background app to a foreground app. That's important because apps that are running in the background have certain restrictions. So for instance, if you're running something with a worker, workers are actually limited to 10 minutes at most that they can run. Is everybody with me there? So that documentation is actually kind of hard to find. But workers their jobs are limited by default to 10 minutes, and that actually comes from the job scheduler. So you can't have a job that runs longer than 10 minutes. If you want to have it running longer than 10, you have to be showing one of these ongoing notifications. One of these ongoing notifications allows your app to run things in the background for longer than 10 minutes. If you don't, you can't. So that means things like if I'm uploading a video, that video is probably going to take 10 minutes, longer than 10 minutes to upload. So I'm going to need to show one of these ongoing notifications while that's happening, because otherwise Android will kill my app midway before I get done uploading it. So those ongoing notifications are pretty important. We'll see that here. I've implemented that as part of the Primes app, so that it can be running in the background longer than that. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Those are pretty important. Next up, in terms of delivering the notification, so we talked about just how to build the notifications out. The way that you deliver it is you again go back to the notification manager. So the notification manager, you get that from it's a system service, so you get that by calling get system service. And then once you have the manager, you just call notify and pass in the notification. It will then make it appear on screen. Now, notify takes two arguments. It takes, first of all, a notification ID, which is a number, as well as a notification object itself. So the notification ID has to be unique within your application. And what actually happens if you send the same notification with the same ID, rather than showing a new notification, it will actually replace that notification. So if I already had a notification out there with ID 3, I send another notification with ID 3, that notification will be replaced. The updated information will be put into there. Okay, so notify is basically the method that we use to send it out. So in terms of actually building out a notification and sending it, here's an example of what that might look like. First, we're going to get the notification manager. We're then going to construct a notification channel, notification compat, notification builder here. So we say pass in the context, pass in the channel ID. We'd provide it a title, which they're doing here, content text. You'll notice that they're translating those. An icon for the notification, a content intent, which is what's going to happen when the user taps on that notification. They're also providing a priority, defaults. Both of these priority and defaults has to do with dealing with older devices, 7.1 prior to 8.0. So those are both related to older devices, both set priority and set defaults. And then we finally call notify. So this is kind of the one example of what the code might look like for actually sending a notification out. It looks a little bit scary. Believe me, it'll make more sense as we go on, as you get used to it. But there is at least a decent amount of code that usually goes into actually sending a notification. But that's what it looks like. Build the notification and call notify. So as I mentioned here, if you need to update a notification, all you do is you just construct a new notification object and say deliver it with the same ID. So if I need to change what the notification says, because the user edited their comment or whatever it may be, if the data is out of date, I just send a new notification with the same ID. It's also possible to cancel the notifications. So the user has a few different ways that they can do that. One of the methods you usually want to call is set auto cancel and set that to true. What that says is when the user taps on the notification, that will automatically cancel itself. So if you want the user to be able to tap on it, it goes away by itself. You just set that true. Otherwise, the default behavior is the user taps on the notification and it just sticks around. So that's a give and take. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. You can also cancel a specific notification if you know the ID, or if you're in a really big bind and you need to cancel all of the notifications for your application, you can call cancel all. But this is definitely something you want to avoid, is calling cancel all. It's usually better to cancel it by the ID. This should be a last resort. And with ongoing notifications, remember we talked about that. Because the user can't cancel them, you have to cancel them either using cancel or cancel all. Compatibility, we talked a little bit about that. I'll let you read more there. So a few guidelines to kind of end this out. Remember that notifications always interrupt your user, so you need to make sure that they're short, they're timely, and they're relevant. If those things aren't met, then your notifications have very little, if any, use. So you should ask yourself, should this notification be, is it really important to the user? Is the user going to be able to do anything with it? And what would happen if they missed it? Then you might want to do some of those. Timely, the time that appears is important as well. So for instance, should it appear right after, immediately as soon as something happens? So say somebody sends you a message, should it appear then? Okay, well then notifications are a good fit. And it also should be short. It shouldn't be, you don't want to put 3 paragraphs of text into a notification that's not very user friendly. You want to limit it usually to a sentence or less of text. Obviously, with the big text style, it is possible to include a whole paragraph of text there, but you should still generally keep it to a minimum. Okay. Any questions about the kind of design principles and theory of notifications at this point?
Are we going to be doing like a code along for this or something?
I'll do a code example here in a minute. I've already written it, and so I'll give you the code for it.
Okay.
So let's take a 20-minute break. We'll come back at 2:31, and we'll look at those code examples. All right. So I posted the link again in Discord to my Android Code Labs Completed repo. This is where the examples are. You're going to find them under 8.3, just like we've done the other ones. So they're not under 8.1, they're under 8.3. And so you'll see there's a few things there. So prime number notifications is the first one we're going to open up and look at. And this is basically just taking the application that we built last week and adding notifications to it. So I'm going to open up that. Android Code Labs Completed. That is 8.3. And I'm going to look at prime number notifications. Okay. So again, this is under 8.3, prime number notifications is the name of the application. And in terms of looking at this app, there's only really two classes that we'll need to look at. One is going to be the application class, and the other is going to be the worker class, and that's where all of the changes happen in terms of notifications. It's just the application and the worker. It's all effectively background work. So two things that this application does. Basically, there are two notifications. The first notification, when you run it, you'll see one that appears as the application is searching for prime numbers. So that's the one that appears, and then when it finishes, it's going to show the second one with this check mark. Right? So that's what we're looking at. I'm going to put post here. Yeah. So that's, what you're saying about it running, that's one of the things I'm doing here. That first notification that appears is an ongoing notification, so that will continue working even if you leave the app.
Mr. Smith, which file are we supposed to open again?
This is under 8.3. This is the prime numbers notifications app. Prime number notifications.
Okay. So it's all in the application right there.
It's in the application and the worker.
Okay.
It's in the application and the worker. It's two places. Yeah. In terms of the, Jonathan, in terms of the notifications you're talking about, in terms of it being there, that's running in the background, those are actually technically supposed to be shown even, as soon as the worker starts. You're not actually supposed to wait until the application goes dormant to do that. You're actually supposed to show that as immediately as it starts.
Is there nothing to stop the worker in the worker class there? I see on line 98 you got something.
Well, let's look at that here in a minute when everybody's got the code pulled up. I think I'm still waiting on one person.
That was me. I had to reset my computer real quick.
Okay. So, in terms of looking at this code, before we get too far into it, I'm going to go into the data source, Prime's data source. This is running kind of fast, so it's hard to see it. So I'm going to move this from 1 million to 100 million. That'll make this take, the first part take longer, so it's easier to see what's going on. So in there on line 23, I'm just going to change this up to 100,000. So what we see now, as it's running, is we can see the progress bar moving, but you can see this notification up here. So it says prime numbers is currently running. And so if I leave the application, okay, it's shut down. I come back in, we'll see it's still going wherever it was when we left. I can also go through the notification, click here, and it'll jump back into the app. So, that's the first notification that I'm showing, is this ongoing notification. So this is happening to say, hey, there's a process running. This is used for anything like this that's running even while you're outside of the app, and specifically things that are more long running. So in this case, getting up to 100 million, well, that's probably going to take more than 10 minutes. So I need that to continue. So that's why I'm giving it an ongoing notification. So in terms of setting up notifications, you'll remember, what's the first thing I have to do in order to be able to show notifications? What is step one?
Don't you have to do it in the application?
Do what in the application?
You have to create the notification channel.
Right, I have to create the channels. So I'm going to jump into the application, so Prime's app, pull that up. And so in here, in onCreate, I've moved this into another method. You could have hard-coded this into the onCreate, but there's enough code that it makes sense to break it out. So I'm calling this method create notification channels. So that's what's doing the actual work of setting things up. So that method's down here on line 51. So I'm going to say create notification channels. I'm going to say first of all, is the build number grade equal to or greater than 26? It's important that it is equal to or greater, because you want to include 26 in that. As long as it's 26 or higher, then I'm going to go ahead and set up that notification channel. Otherwise, I'm not going to do anything here, because remember, these weren't introduced until API 26. So if I didn't have this check here, all of this stuff, as soon as I remove this, you're going to see everything becomes red, right? Notification channel, set description, create notification channel, all of that becomes red because it wasn't available prior to 26. Okay? So do make sure you keep that check in. You'll also notice this thing is kind of showing up in gray, default channel, the name and description. So the code that's actually there, it's kind of collapsing it, because the code that's actually there is calling getString to get the notification channel name and the channel description. So for this app, I'm only using one notification, one channel. I'm calling it the default channel. So first thing we have to do, as you can see, get the system service. We have to get the notification manager. Then we actually build the channel and we create the channel. So this creates the object, and then this registers it with the operating system. It's worth noting that this call to create channel actually only does something the first time. Once I try to create the channel again, this actually does nothing, because it wants to keep the default setup. It wants to keep all the customizations that your user has done for the channel. So if you were to say later change the importance level, that actually won't change anything because the users will still be using their importance from when they installed the app. Okay. So this only does something the first time.
You only need to create one notification channel normally for our purposes here.
For the purposes here, I'm going to create one. But that's not the norm at all. The norm at all is to have 5 or more, actually. The norm is to have quite a few. Okay.
All right. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't understand why you would need more than one. I mean, you would just send your message, right? I mean, that's kind of what it said. Like,
So
prime zap, running, prime zap, stop, prime zap, done. You know, like that seems like that would be it.
Well, for this one, for instance, it actually would make sense for me to have 2 channels. I only created 1, but it actually would make sense for me. It would make sense for me to have 2, because this ongoing notification here is probably a lower importance than the notification that it's finished. Does that make sense?
So you'd have one for running and one for when it's done.
So I if I was going to set this up properly, I really would create one for running and one for done. And this one, I would have it a low importance, which is what it is right now. So you saw it didn't pop up. It didn't show make a sound when it started, versus the one that when it's finished. Well, I probably do want that one to pop up and make a sound. So it actually would make sense for those 2 notifications to have a different channel, which often can end up being the case for every different notification that you send. You often end up with a separate channel. So if your application has 20 different ways to send a notification, you could very well end up with 20 channels, and that might not be a bad thing. That might be a very desirable thing. So don't steer away from having a lot of channels. Having one channel is generally not what you want. It's usually better to have more.
Okay. If you use the same channel again, then it'll override what's already there.
Right? It won't override it.
It will.
Oh, what do you mean override it? No, it won't override it.
Oh, okay. So you can have 2 notifications on the same channel that show up.
Yes, you can have 2 notifications on the same channel. You have 10 notifications on the same channel.
But they will necessarily have the same importance level because you only set that there.
Yeah, they will be just important. And so all the notifications that come onto this default channel, like the user only has the option of make them all show sound or make them not show sound. There's no like some of them show sound and some of them don't. So oftentimes you need to break things up. So that's how that one's set up, is importance low. I could also set this one, I remember minimum is the other one. Let's see, low is 2, minimum is 1. So let's just see what happens if I set it as minimum instead of setting it as low, right? So one of the things we noticed is there was an icon there, and that actually looks to be the same. I remember at least for non-ongoing ones, and maybe this is different for ongoing ones. Typically, if you have a minimum level notification, that's going to not be there. It typically won't show the icon in the status bar. But I think that's different for that. Although I didn't uninstall and reinstall yet. That's what I need to do. Okay, so let's just see what happens if I change this to high. So I'm going to change this to high. And remember that high says that it should make a sound. If I run the app right now, notice that there's no sound, right? And if I were to go into settings, and so let me drill into this. So settings, apps and notifications, and we'll go to the prime numbers app. And so you see there's a notification section here. This is where we're at. So there's the default channel, and I could go in here. Here it's set to silent. If I switch it up to default, it should make sound here, which it did. I don't know if you heard that or not, but yeah, I can change it that way, and change how the behavior is if I want to change, from my perspective.
What's the squiggly line?
What's the squiggly line? It's just saying approximately 1 per day. So it reads that based on how frequently you send it. So we can configure all of that, or I could even potentially turn it off. Just say, hey, I don't want to have those notifications. And if I run the app now, that notification won't appear because I've disabled it. Now, so what happens if I've made a change to the importance and I want to see what happens with that new importance? Because remember, I previously had this as low. Well, in order for that new importance to take place, I actually need to delete the channel or uninstall the app, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm going to uninstall the app and run it again. So as you're playing with the importance there, you see you may need to remember to, if you change the importance, you'll need to uninstall and reinstall the app. Otherwise, you won't see the new importance level. Okay? Does everybody follow me there?
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to low because that's what we had it set to. But if I want to go back to low, again, I need to uninstall it. So app info, uninstall. And so if I uninstall and reinstall any of those, the level you set, the importance that you set initially, plus any of the configuration that the users put in there, obviously that's reset back to defaults. Okay. So that's good. So we've got one notification that appears while it's running. Now, we saw how to set up the notification channel. So this is the process of how you do that. There's just a tiny bit of code to put in there. You will notice there's a few constants that I refer to here. So for instance, I'll refer to default notification channel ID. So that's just the string default channel. You can put in whatever string you want there to identify the channel. So if I have a running notification, I could call that running, and I had a finished, I can call that finished. Here down here next, I have two notification IDs that I've defined because I'm going to use those later. So I've defined the foreground notification, which is this one. I've given this an ID of 1, and the one that fires when it's finished is an ID of 2 because I needed those to have different IDs. You can use any integers you want. They don't have to start with 1. They don't have to be sequential, but they do have to be unique. So I could have called this 50 and 72, and that would have been fine. They just need to be different. And so it's usually good to all of the IDs like this, the channel IDs and the notification IDs, all of these you should make constants in your application object, because you're going to find that you need to use them in multiple places in the application. So that's a good central point for that. And that also helps you know that they're unique. Because if I, for instance, were to split out these numbers, put the notification IDs in other classes, then I wouldn't really know if I'm using 1 for 2 different notifications or if I'm using 2 for 2 different notifications. So that makes it easier to see if you're using duplicate numbers by putting them here. So I'm going to go into my worker now. And so in my worker, what I'm doing is I'm saying when it's done. And remember, we go back to 1 million as my endpoint instead of 100 million. That's my data source. So that'll finish a lot quicker. So when I get done is when I'm sending the notification here that it's done. And so the code for that, I'm in the wrong place. I want to go into the worker. So remember the worker finishes, and so we go through this loop testing all the different things. When we finally get to here, say the current is greater than the max, we know we're done. I'm calling this method, show finished notification. So that's a method I've defined. And I'm passing into it a context because several things you need, several things in terms of setting up a notification require a context. And as it turns out, a worker is not a context. So you can't just use this. You can't just say this dot get string, this dot start activity, etc. You have to actually have a context object. So I'm calling get application context to get that context. Okay, so that's the important method there. So show finish notification, and show finish notification. Here's where I actually set up the notification. So the first thing I want to do is I'm setting up some logic so that when you tap on it, because I want to be, close this out, if you tap on it, I want it to take you into my application. So if I click on it here, it should go open and run this. Now I've had some bugs, as you kind of saw there, with the notifications on the emulator. The emulator tends to crash anytime I click on a notification. So I would definitely advise you do this on the physical device instead of the emulator, because I keep getting system UI crashing here. But so I click on that and it'll take me directly into the app. So the way I build that out, you see I'm first creating an intent. And so this part is to figure out what should it do when you tap on the notification. So I'm going to create an intent, points to main activity, just like we've learned all the way back to lesson 1. I'm setting a flag on here. Now this is kind of interesting. So I'm setting flag activity current top. This was mentioned in one of the previous lessons. I didn't really talk about it because it wasn't relevant at the time. But when you get to here and dealing with notifications, oftentimes you have to pay attention to where should it appear and where should the backstack be. So for instance, if I didn't have this here, what would happen is I would get another main activity being launched on top of the main activity that's already running. So this could potentially lead me into a stack of like 5 different main activities all being open at once, right? It's not what I want, right? So by setting this flag here, as I'm saying, I want to clear all of the activities that are on top of main activity. So if this application had other activities, all of those would be closed and we just go to main activity and resume the one that's already open instead of creating a new main activity. Is everybody with me there? So this is, so usually you'll want to set that with notifications. You'll need to set at least one of those flags. There are a lot of different flags and you can look and read about the details of them. This I think is usually the right one, flag activity clear top. But there are other ones that are commonly used, such as new task and clear task, and there's a bunch of different ways you can configure this. But the whole goal is that you want to make sure that the backstack ends up built the right way, and you don't want to have multiple main activities or multiple detail activities or what it may be, because your backstack can get very complicated with the notifications in play. So we're going to set that flag. Another thing I will note on there, this also jives with another thing that you can put into the manifest. So for instance here, I put the launch mode on main activity as single task. And so what that says is that main activity can't be placed in multiple tasks. The default otherwise, if you don't set any launch mode, is that you can have multiple copies of main activity in multiple tasks. So I'm saying that there can only be one within this task. Again, there's a bunch of different flags and bunch of different launch modes that you can use there. But that's the one that is kind of the simplest and probably one of the ones you want to use if you're opening this from a notification.
So you're saying if that's not in there, it probably won't work.
If that's not in there, then it'll end up with multiple main activities.
So it just slows your system down.
It'll slow your system down. It also means your back button behaves weird, because if I have, say, 3 main activities stacked on each other, if I go back from here, I'm going from main activity back to main activity, and then I click it again. I'm going back from main activity to main activity. So if I don't do that, then my back button breaks.
Okay. Would it hurt to put single task in any case, even if we're not doing this stuff like notifications?
It all depends. It all depends. So what single task says is I can only have one copy of that within a task. And so for things where that makes sense, yeah, no harm done. But that's not always, single task doesn't always work. Single task is not always going to work for every app in every situation, which is why it's not the default.
Okay.
Okay. So if what you have to do is you have to remember, we talked about how to diagram the different screens in your app and the flow in there. So you can say, okay, well, from this activity, I can go to activity A or activity B. From activity C, I can go from activity D or E. You have to look at that diagram to figure out what the launch mode should be. Does that make sense?
If it wasn't single task, what would it be then? Multiple task?
It would be you'd leave it off as the default.
Oh, okay.
The default is there's no rules on it. There's no limits. You can have as many copies of that activity running as you want. So all the different launch modes that you can set, they put restrictions on the number of copies that you can have, is what they do. So this is oftentimes, yes, single task is oftentimes a good one, and most of the time you can set that. Most of the time it's good to design your apps in such a way that you can set it to that. But there are plenty of apps out there that just won't work, where that's just not an option. So again, you have to really look at the diagram. And basically the thing you're looking for is anywhere there's loops. Where if I was on, say, this activity B, if I can go from activity B back to activity B, well, then this isn't going to work for me. So you're basically looking for loops in your diagram. If there's a loop in your diagram that involves that, you're probably not going to be able to set a single task. So going back to the worker, right? So that's what I'm setting up there. That's all about getting the backstack right. And so I create the intent, and then from the intent, I'm going to say pending intent.getActivity. I'm going to pass that intent in, and that gives me my pending intent. So I'm taking an intent, converting it to a pending intent. Pending intent is just an intent that can be called later. So that pending intent is what I'm going to provide then down later on 130. So it can be used as, here's what you do when you click on it. So a notification, to construct the notification, you're going to start with notification compat builder. You kind of saw this on the slide. I'm passing in that context. You'll notice that the context is coming in from a parameter here on line 117. Remember, I got that through calling get application context. So I pass in the context. I pass in the notification ID. So that tells it what notification, what context it should go on, and then I want to provide the title and the text of that notification. So here I'm doing context.getString. App name is the name is what I'm using as the title. That's where you're seeing like Prime's app is the title, and then notification finish text is what I'm using as the text. You can really use any string you want there. This title does not need to be the application name at all. Oftentimes it is, but it doesn't need to be. It can be whatever you want, whatever makes sense for you. The set small icon here, you can see I'm setting it to R drawable IC done. That's just a vector asset that we've seen how to make those before. So I'm using the done icon there, content, and you'll see I'm setting auto cancel to true. So remember, auto cancel true says when I tap on the notification, that should cancel the notification. Otherwise, the notification, that check mark, will stay up there constantly. Won't go away when I click on it. And then finally, all of this just create the notification, but if I stop there, you won't actually see the notification. So to get it actually show up on screen, you've got to get the notification manager and then call notify on that notification manager. So here I'm providing that ID2 and the notification object. So this is basically, this is all the magic to actually make that finished notification appear. Okay. Any questions on this so far?
No, I gotta understand the stuff we did yesterday with the worker before I can even begin to think about this, though.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
I'm way behind on that.
Yeah, don't think about that too much right now because that's not relevant to what we're doing in this example. We'll look at that again in the next example. So the next example, I'm doing something with the internet.
Oh, good. Okay.
So another thing you want to see in here, the way I do the running notification is a little bit different. So you'll see at the end that I called the notification manager and called notify. In order to set up a notification that says that this application is running or an ongoing notification, you have to do something a little bit different. So first of all, here I'm saying set ongoing true. And then here at the end, I'm calling the special method set foreground async. So set foreground async says that this worker is going to be running long term, and so it needs to keep the application in the foreground while it's running. And so that method requires a foreground info object, which is part of the worker, the work manager APIs. So worker foreground info takes a notification ID and a notification. So this notification will stay up. The idea is that this will stay up. I'll start this when the worker starts, and then it'll automatically dismiss itself when the worker completes. So the place that I call this show foreground notification is just the very first thing in do work. So if you have something that's going to take a long time to run and you want the user to be able to see it while it's running, that it's still running in the app bar, or specifically that you need it to be running while the app's not running, then that's how you get that up, is that kind of code. So we start that there, and then as I kind of mentioned, it auto dismisses. So I don't actually have to cancel it myself if I set it up that way. In fact, as it turns out, I can't. It will do the cancel anyway. Okay, so those are the two notifications and how they're set up. On that notification as it's running, if you pay attention, you'll notice that I've also put in there a stop button, which I need to make it take longer so I can actually kill it. So make it go up to 100,000. As it's running, if I pull this notification down here, you can see prime numbers currently running, and I've got a stop action on it. So that I've set up with another pending intent here. So this is the stop intent. That's what I want it to do when I click on stop. So if I click that, you can see that the worker stops running. So you can set that up too if you need a way to abort it midway. So the way you get that, you're going to call workmanager.getInstance, create cancel pending intent. That's kind of the magic to make that special intent, which is how you cancel it. So you can then take that intent, and here I've put it as an action, so hooked it up to that stop button. I could have just set it up as the content intent, so the user taps on it. I find that that's not very user friendly. To have it on the main action, it makes more sense to me as a button, but that's how you can set that up. So create a pending intent and provide it as an action. That gives the user a way to stop it midway if you want them to stop it midway. Okay. Questions before we leave this example?
I just want to see it with the internet stuff because that's where I'm stuck. Mostly the worker stuff. I think I get this notification thing for the most part. I mean, I need your code to do it, but
Yeah.
for the I am.
Which is fine. I always have to look up code examples to go do this. There's enough lines of code in here that I cannot keep this in my head.
No, there's no way. But yeah, I mean, at least for me, I would say with the work manager stuff and using with the internet application, I'd like to be able to get from like 5% understanding to feeling like, like if someone came to me and said, "What are you doing with work manager? Like, what does it do? What does it replace?" And like, well, it just does stuff in the background, and that's about all I can tell you.
Well, that's kind of part of the problem is the work manager can do things in the background, anything in the background. And the two important words that they mentioned was that it needs to be guaranteed and deferrable. Guaranteed and deferrable. So it's work that you want to be guaranteed that it will run eventually, but it's also deferrable in the sense that you don't have a timeline on it. It can wait. If it waits 24 hours for that to run, no big deal. That's the kind of work that you do with Work Manager. Things that need to be guaranteed and deferrable, that they can wait till later. So if both of those things are good, then both of those things are true, then work managers and workers are for you. If on the other hand you don't need a guarantee, or you need it, if you need it immediately, then an async task is better. Cool.
Yeah, this worker stuff that completely removes async task and async task loader, right?
What did I just say?
It's designed to take it out.
In most cases, but what did I just say?
That's kind of why I was asking to confirm that there.
What I said is if you need to have it happen immediately, async task may still be the better choice.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, if it can just be done in any old time, then this is the work manager.
Yeah, then this is always better. So, if you need to say, okay, the user clicks buy, and then you want to go do something, well, the problem is you want it to happen immediately. So work manager may not be a good fit for you. But there's a catch, though, in that same example in the buy, right? That's actually guaranteed work, right? You want to guarantee that we'll finish purchasing, placing your order, not accidentally abort it midway, right? And so if I use async task, I actually don't get a guarantee that it will complete or that it won't be half done. So if I use async task for purchasing well, it might the order might get partially through. I might pay the money but not get the products if I'm using async task. Does that make sense?
Yeah, async task may not execute.
Yeah, it's not guaranteed that that's going to finish, right? Because async task is basically just for doing things as long as the user's on that screen. So, yeah. So it doesn't necessarily completely replace it. There are still places where async task is going to be used, but it does completely replace async loader.
Okay, yeah, there were some multiple choice questions about async loader. I saw that. Kind of hard to find that stuff, honestly.
Yeah.
Into the answers. I mean, it's buried in there. And
yeah, async loader was very, very short-lived where it was useful. The period of time where it's like here it was introduced and now it's basically gone was not very long.
All right, the fortune cookie one though, that I'm kind of hanging a lot on that
Yeah.
because of, I just want to see it work with the internet because I'm right now I'm trying to think, how am I going to get these labs done? Because it's,
Mm-hmm.
I just don't get the big picture, like in terms of the weather, like how I'm going to feed the data in and everything. Like I'm talking about the 50,000 foot level stuff, not like once I get down to it and I know I need to send a notification here, I'll muddle through the examples and get it.
Hey,
But
Paul?
the architecture at the top level, I'm not getting that part yet. And maybe others are in the same spot. I don't know.
Can I talk here?
Oh yeah.
So, we're going to look at the Fortune Cookie app. So I'm going to hop over to that. And let me actually pull up the URL first. And let's talk about the endpoint that it's connecting to. So the endpoint that this is connecting to is actually really simple. It's at this website. It's called API Fortune Cookie. It's the path to it. And all it does is it returns a simple JSON object that's got these two strings, fortune cookie and fortune and timestamp. That's all that's in there, right? So it's returning a fortune. And so you've got fortune and timestamp. That's all the data that's there. So this is a pretty simplified sort of API. And what it does is every 5 minutes, this will generate a new cookie. If I refresh here now, you'll see it changes. The timestamp stays the same because that timestamp just reflects the last time it came up with a new fortune. So I can kind of watch this and see, well, I want to watch this and find out when there's a new fortune, basically is my goal. Is everybody with me there? And so you could think of this as like, well, what if I have a list of news stories, right? And I want to see when there's a new news story, or I want to see when there's a new post on my Facebook feed. This could be the same thing. We could watch an XML document, a JSON document like this and see when there's changes. And usually we do this by looking at timestamps. Generally speaking, that's the interesting thing you're going to look at. See, is there a timestamp that changes? If you've got IDs, you might also look that IDs change. So you're going to kind of watch that. If you're talking about weather, basically you'd see, well, when does the forecast change? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you just continuously look at this on a regular interval and see when is there something new. And so that's what we're going to be doing. I will mention here real quickly, this is on a website that I built for AWD, some example endpoints that can be used to test and play around with things. These I've used for a few different classes, although this is a brand new version that I've built in Node. Previously it was built in C#, but this is built in Node. And so if you want to look at the specific documentation on these endpoints, you can just go to AWD example services heroku.com and you'll kind of see what's there. And that's where it also says here, hey, the fortune changes every 5 minutes. So if you do want to read some documentation on how these work, you can go there. Later after spring break, we'll be actually using this one down here under products. We'll be using that set of APIs. So there's some products, there's some shopping cart, there's a few other things here that you can that we'll play around with some later assignments shortly. So kind of just getting you oriented. That's what's there. Okay. So let's look at, what do I need to do in terms of getting this data? So the place I usually start is by modeling the data, right? So if I think about modeling this data, I need to create a class that represents the data that comes back, right? So what should I call this? What should I call this?
What are we looking at? Are we supposed to see your code right now?
Okay, I could call that a fortune. You should see my browser.
Okay, yeah, the name of the object, yeah.
Right.
I would call, a fortune, why not?
Okay, we could call it a fortune. Anything else I could call it? Not saying the fortune's a bad name. But what are some other names I could use?
Well, it's random, right? So would you put the word random in there?
Probably not. Probably not. Because it doesn't really, the word random doesn't really mean anything. Here. Plus random's already the name of the class. So fortune stamp, I would say generally don't call it based on the name of the things that are inside of it. So, like fortune timestamp is probably not a great name. Usually the place I go for naming is actually looking at the URL. So in terms of the URL, this is at API fortune cookie. So therefore, a good name for this would be a fortune cookie. Does that make sense? Or I might call this a fortune cookie response or a fortune response, right? Because it's a response to my request. Is everybody with me there?
Yeah, like we had, what was it called? Something API response. I can't remember.
Yeah.
What
So
we
I could call this fortune cookie API response, right? So you can really call this class a lot of different things, but the long and short of it is it needs to have two things in it. It's going to have a string that is called fortune, and it's going to have a string called timestamp. You know, you can call it a few different things, but it has to have those two exactly by that name, because that's what's in the JSON. So because that's what's in the JSON, if I look into my model, well, you'll see a class named fortune. So fortune has a public string fortune and a public string timestamp, right? So that's where I start, is modeling the data. And again, so one of the things to note here, this is a simplified example inserted as an API. I will say that what's going to be on your test and what I would expect you to find out in your lab is your JSON is going to be significantly more complicated than this. So this is, take that with a grain of salt. This is a very simplified example because the API is very simple. Okay. Just to get the kind of structure in place to understand, what you need. But in reality, you're probably going to need more than one class to model this data. Okay, so that's a fortune, right? So we start with that. Then kind of walking up another level, I have my fortune data source, which is basically just a holder for a fortune. So in here I have a mutable live data, right? Which is just a wrapper around a fortune object. So basically that makes it so it's observable. So you can observe and watch when the fortune changes. Okay, so that fortune live data, I start with nothing in there. So initially, this fortune is going to be null. Is everybody with me there? Initially, the fortune in here is going to be null.
Yeah.
So I've got a few getters and setters, so I can get the fortune live data. I have a getter for the fortune itself, and I also have the setter for the fortune. So this is the part that's going to be called on the worker thread, where I call fortune live data.post value. So this is what happens, when I get a new, anytime the worker gets a new fortune, it's going to call set fortune here. And so that's what's going to update the UI, is this method right here. Okay? So this is the pass through. That one method is the pass through from the back end to the front end.
Okay. Maybe you hit on this already, but of course I'm thinking in terms of the weather app, which takes an input of a city, country, state, whatever. This is just pulling data that's out there. There's no inputs.
So it's fine. It would be that there are no inputs doesn't matter a lot. So what I would do for the inputs, there's two different ways you can deal with that. One way is you can add that as live data here. So I can add a live data for the city, the state, and the country. So if I have inputs, one way to do it is just to add some more live data here, right? So live data for each of those three strings.
But that's based on user input. So
Right.
like, let's
That's
just
fine.
say, I don't know, for this, let's see,
Hey,
fortunes
Paul.
about,
Paul,
mm,
it doesn't matter where the data comes from. Live data, the data can come from anywhere.
okay. How do you feed it in from the user?
I would just add a setter here, right? So what I would do is I would say, hey, I want to have data. I'd say, okay, when you hit search or whenever you hit send or get or whatever, when you hit the search button, basically, it would then put the data in here and start the worker. The other way you can do it is passing it as input data, because those are still 3 strings is still a small amount of data. You could pass it as input data when you start the worker. Both of those ways are acceptable, right? So you'd either do it as live data, you could do it as, or you could do it as input data to the work request. Okay. If your question is on the input data, I'll do that. I'll go over that with you on a one-by-one basis.
Okay, all right, yeah, that's,
But on the
I hear you.
output data, the output part of this is going to be the same for everybody, because you're going to have data that's going to come out because this is what the service, this is what the API is returning, so I need to make that data available to the UI. So this is how I make that output data available. So we've got that data source, and if I look at the main activity, the main activity is basically observing that live data and calling show fortune on it. So whenever we get a new fortune, we pull it out of the live data. If there's no fortune, then we don't do anything. But once we get a fortune, we say fortune's not null. And then we're going to say, okay, let's pull out the timestamp. I'm doing some formatting on the timestamp to get it to show up as this, to show up how long it's been, and showing that text. So there's, that's kind of what's happening on the front end, is I'm just saying, okay, when that live data changes, then we're going to update the 2 texts here, which is how long has it been since that fortune was generated, and what is that fortune currently. I've also set this up so that if you click on the fortune cookie, it will actually make a new work request and go out and initiate that. So I can actually just go do it when I want on demand. So that's how I would implement a refresh, is I just make a button that can, in this case I'm clicking on the image view, and I can just start a one-time work request to go get the fortune. Okay, so that's how you can do the one-off stuff. So let's look at the more interesting pieces. Kind of going in, because we're talking about notifications. So where does that fit in? So the fortune cookie app, just like the other example, just creates the notification channels when the application starts. So that same code is here. I'm creating my notification channel when the application starts. I don't wait until the worker gets a new fortune cookie. I just create that right away. So the user doesn't have to wait for there to be a notification to configure it. Okay. So let's look into what does the worker do. Okay, now the worker does a lot of stuff that we've kind of seen in separate examples, but I'm starting to put these things together. So first thing I'm going to do in terms of the constructor is I'm going to say, well, let's get the application and then the data source. I need those to later be able to show the fortune cookie onto the screen, because I'm going to use that data source to update things. You'll notice I have a few constants up top. So first of all, I have my log tag, and I also have my base URL. So my base URL points to that endpoint that we just looked at. Okay, everybody with me so far?
Yeah.
So let's go down to do work. So in terms of do work, again, we've seen a lot of this stuff before, so most of the stuff shouldn't look new. First, I'm doing a quick log just so I know that it actually ran, so I know that it's running, because it doesn't take long enough that I need an ongoing notification, so I don't have one. So I'm just saying check for new fortune. That way I can look at the log and see, did it actually run, and when did it run. So I'm going to create my connection, or declare my connection variable. You can see the try opening up, and all the way at the end here I have my finally, which is going to disconnect that connection. So, because I want to make sure that I'm cleaning up after myself. Going back up top, so first thing I want to do is build out the URL. This case is a very simplified one because my URL is always the same. So I'm skipping that URI builder. Again, most of the time you'll need that URI builder because you usually have some dynamic parts or some query parameters you're passing. In this case, I don't. So I'm just directly turning that string into a URL. So this is one of those cases where this is a simplified scenario. So you should have more code here, not just a string. But so I'm passing in the base URL. I'm opening up the connection. Same kind of configuration that we've seen before. URL open connection, set connection read timeout. Here I'm setting the connect timeout to 60 seconds and the read timeout to 15 seconds. That gives it a nice amount of window so that it has a good chance to connect without failing. Because having those timings a little bit tighter turned out to, at least in my experience, not be good. So I've loosened those timings there. The request method is get, and I've also said do input is true because I do want to read the response that comes back. So all of that shouldn't be new. It's the same stuff we're doing with connect. I've just increased the timeouts a little bit. And now in terms of reading the output, reading the response from the server. So remember, first step is to ask for the input stream. Okay, that input stream is now going to be wrapped up into an input stream reader, and that's going to be wrapped up into a buffered reader. So remember, input stream I can use to read any series of that reads as binary data. So I can read the binary data that's coming from the server. That would be enough if I was just trying to read, say, an image or download a PDF. I wouldn't need a reader. But since I want JSON, which is text, I need to read it using a reader. So I wrap the input stream reader around there, which will give me it as characters instead of as bytes. And then I can wrap the buffered reader around there, again, providing some efficiency. So that's the basic setup, and we've seen most of that up to now. Finally, I'm going to create my JSON object. Remember, I'm going to use that to parse the JSON. And so that's my JSON parser and formatter. And so here's kind of where we start getting into the actual logic. So I say JSON.from JSON, give it the reader, and I want to read it as a fortune. So once that's all done, I now have the fortune from the server. Is everybody with me there? So all this stuff we've kind of seen in different places. I think we originally saw it in an async task. Now you're seeing it in a worker. Okay, questions?
Right, so we're in line 72, that's where we're passing it.
Yeah, so this is where the new stuff is, right? So this is where all the new stuff is. So here I say, okay, first of all, I want to find out, is this a new fortune or is this the same fortune that we saw previously? So in terms of, running this, I'm going to say, okay, well, I've got, let's get the old fortune, which I'm going to get from the data source. I'm going to say, give me the current live day, give me the current value. So this is whichever one I've seen previously. Now, remember, initially, I'm starting out with that live data as being null, right? So initially, old fortune will be null the first time this runs. And I don't want to send a notification the first time this happens. Does that make sense? I don't want to send a notification immediately when the application starts. Is everybody with me? So I only want to send a notification if it's new or it's changed later on. So I'm going to go ahead and check if there is no original fortune, if old fortune is null. Then I'm just going to say, hey, fortune initialized, and we'll just update the data source. So 72, that's only happens the first time through. So from there on out, if I find a new fortune, that's where we're going to see notifications. So this first time through, we don't do anything interesting. We just say, hey, save the fortune. What I'm going to do then is I'm going to say, well, objects equals. So this is a kind of a wrapper that helps deal with nulls. So I'm going to say, if the fortune is the same and the timestamp is the same, if those two things are the same, then there's nothing new, we're done, right? So in this case, I'm just saying that those two things are identical. In your example, if you're looking at your API response, your check will probably be a little bit more complicated. You'll probably need to do a little bit more digging into the object and find a timestamp that you can go off of. And usually that will end up being like the first thing in a list or the last thing in the list, depending on if it's sorted from old to new or new to old. Okay. Questions?
No, not yet. I understand. From the data source that we get when the fortune's initialized.
Yep.
Can you track that through to how it displays on the UI? Just real quick. I think I know how it's done, but I just want to see it.
Let's finish this side up before I do that.
Okay.
So in this case where it's the first time, that's where we're updating the data source. I'm not doing anything if there's no change. If there's no change to the timestamp, then we're done. And I really don't need to check the fortune. I just need to check the timestamp. But that's what I had done here to kind of show you what would happen if you need to check more than one thing. And then if there is one of those things that changed, so the fortune changed or the timestamp changed, then I'm going to log new fortune, update the fortune. This is kind of the same thing as line 72. So we say, okay, we're going to show the new fortune to the screen and finally show the notification. So I'm only showing that notification if we've seen a new fortune, but I don't do it the first time. Is everybody with me there?
Yeah. With the else if.
Yeah.
All right. So what? It's the same. Just give me the timestamp and the fortune and put it there again. What's the harm in that?
Because first of all, I don't want to show a notification here, because that would show every time that we go run this worker. Right. So if I show the notification here, I'm going to be showing notification when there's not new data, when the data is the same that the user's already seen. So you don't want to show notification here, and I don't need to update the UI because the UI is already up to date.
Okay, it's just a log to show that nothing's changed. That's it.
Yeah.
There's nothing for the user in that.
Yeah.
Or will there be? Okay.
Yeah. And there's no need to.
It's just showing the worker's working.
Right. It's just showing. That way I can look at my log and see, okay, that's where it got. It determined that nothing is new. Because a lot of the debugging that you do with this, you're going to need to be doing this through Logcat to diagnose and see what your application did. This is one place when you're dealing with notifications and workers like this. The debugger is not really a great tool for diagnosing this because timing tends to be such a big deal. Plus, it's a matter of if you put the debugger in there, it changes how the foreground and background stuff works. So basically, you can't debug this with the debugger. So that's why you need to do it this way. Is having a bunch of log messages is super useful to go and figure out what actually happened and diagnose your code. Finally, assuming all that went through, I'm just going to say let's return success. So we successfully got a fortune, we dealt with it, we handled it, we're done. So I'm going to say result success. If anything went wrong, okay, then I get into my catches. So in my catches, you'll notice I have 3 different catches. Does everybody see that?
Yeah, and those are in a specific order. It has to be in that order, right?
Yes, they are in a specific order, and they do need to be in that order. So the reason they need to be in that order is because IO exception is a subclass of exception, and malformed exception is a subclass of IO exception. So because of the class hierarchy, they have to be in this order, otherwise they won't all get hit, because it takes the first one that matches. Okay, so if I had put IO exception up here, then malformed would never get run. If I put exception up earlier, then the other two wouldn't get run. So they need to be in that specific order because of their class hierarchies. So a malformed URL exception, what would cause me to get that kind of exception?
Well, if you coded it right, it would be maybe the data service provider changing their URL on you, right?
No.
Or an internet connection problem, that could be it too.
Neither. No.
Okay.
So the only way for you to get a malformed URL exception is if there's a bug in this code up here. That's the only way to get that. Is if there's a mistake in how you're building up the URL. So if you build up an invalid URL, it's going to fail up here with a malformed URL exception. It won't even get down to line 54. If there's a problem with URL, it won't even get down to creating a connection. Is everybody with me there? So one of the things that means is if you're having an error here with the URL, it's not going to get fixed if you just try to do it again. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're debugging using the logcat because the user's not going to see that in line 90.
But what I'm saying is if it were to try it again, it's going to try it with the same URL.
Yeah, there's no fixing it.
There's no fixing it. So in here, I'm just going to say return result failure because there's no point in retrying it because it will always get that same exception. If I had said return retry here, it would try it again and just continuously fail, which would spin and burn the battery as well as your network. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, you put failure in there to save your battery.
Yeah, I put failure in there to save the battery, which means it won't get rescheduled to run this again. It's done. And so that's actually this will cancel the periodic update is done. Like if that runs, it's never going to do it again. So that's worth noting. That's what's going on there. The next thing is if I get an IO exception, right? So an IO exception would be if there's a blip in the internet. So for instance, if I go into a tunnel and it cuts off midway, then I would get an IO exception, right? And so in those cases, it makes sense that I want to try it again later because it was an intermittent problem. Does that make sense, everybody?
Yeah, the intermittent, the interval. Where's that set, and how do we? I know it's approximate, and it'll try to do it, but
we haven't gotten there yet. We haven't gotten there yet.
Okay.
Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet. So I'm saying if this intermittent, I'm going to retry it. And so that uses the kind of the retry behavior. And so that'll try it again, depending on how you've configured all that, which is, there's a lot of options there for the fallback and things like that. So this says, try it again in say 5 minutes or whatever. And so that'll trigger a retry. Versus then here, I'm saying if it's any other thing, well, then go ahead and just give up because you're probably not going to because it's probably a bug in the code and it's probably not going to fix itself. Does that make sense? So I've got failure, retry, and failure.
Yeah, when you get down to it, it really comes down to most of the time you're going to have internet connection. That's not going to be an issue. It's just your URL. So this should work most of the time.
Yeah, should work most of the time. And so, but you have to kind of cover your back with the different kinds of exceptions that you could get in making sure you catch those and deal with them. So the thing that I want you to see is just, that, hey, I've got a different log messages in those different cases, and sometimes I'm returning failure, sometimes I'm returning retry based on what kind of exception it is. And so you'll want to have that same kind of stack of different kinds of exception because you want to treat them differently. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about the UI. So what I said is whether it gets in here, it's called set fortune on line 72 or 8080, whichever route it goes into, that's where the UI is going to be updated, right? So if I call set fortune, what does set fortune do? Well, it says fortune live data dot post value. Everybody see that? Now remember, I'm calling this method from the worker thread. So right now this code is running on the background thread. It's not running on the UI thread. So I can't directly from this thread update anything on the UI, right? So I call this on the background thread. What actually happens then later will not be immediate. So this post value returns immediately. It returns before the UI is updated, right? So my code's gonna in the background thread is gonna keep going, even if the UI isn't updated. Is everybody with me there? So it's not gonna be blocked. So that we call post value, and then later in the foreground is where we pick up and see that event. So if I look at my main activity, you see here in onCreate where I call observe, that's where it's picking up the event. That's where it's picking up this function here, this lambda, is what gets called when the fortune's updated.
While you got that highlighted there, is there a way to convert back and forth to toggle lambda? Because
there's a way to I think you can use alt-enter to convert it to lambda, but you can't convert it back.
Yeah, all right. I'm trying to understand what that would be in like a more traditional way. I remember JavaScript, of course, but this is not. We just haven't encountered it as much as the method.
It's basically new observer, and then it's like I forget what the event is. Is there? Yeah, they don't have a way to. There's not a way to easily convert it back.
What I'm thinking is when I got to type it out, I don't think I can type it explicitly in Lambda, can I?
Yeah, you actually can. You can just start writing it this way. You can just write it that way, and that's honestly, I think, a lot easier to just jump in there. But if you're trying to start it the other way and then convert it,
yeah, this is helpful. What you're doing here.
New observer fortune, and so basically the old syntax, the non-lambda syntax would look like that.
Okay, and what that does is it just monitors the
live
data. It's kind of like notified data set change, right? Isn't that kind of what's going on there?
It's a little bit like, it's maybe a little bit similar, but notified data set change is actually it's more like this. That's the post value part. That's where saying that there's a change, whereas this is listening for a change.
Yeah, the post value is kind of like if we're adding, it's not a list, but it's kind of like we're adding a new piece of data to a list.
Yeah.
Like, hey, this is this just in from the API.
Yeah.
Post the value, and then this picks it up.
Yep.
And okay, show fortune.
Yep.
Is that inside main activity?
Yeah, that's inside main activity. So that's what does all the logic to actually get the UI up to screen.
That's the UI. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So the basically the important part though is you call post value in the data source, and then you observe in the activity.
Mm-hmm. And the interval, did I see that down below?
That's not here.
Okay.
That's just formatting logic.
Yeah, right. Okay. It updated while we were working on this, I saw.
Okay.
Yeah, like apparently 7.5 minutes ago.
Yeah. So does that answer your question of the from the front to the back?
Yeah, the only thing that I'm got questions on
Mm-hmm.
is the interval, which I think I can find. That's not a
Yeah.
big deal. But
Yeah.
as I talked to you outside of class, it seemed
Yeah.
erratic the way it was updating it. I mean,
I
it
do
was,
want to. Do want to talk about the interval here. What I'm
yeah,
asking is, does anybody else have questions here? Is everybody kind of understanding the pathway with the worker? Cool. Okay. So let's look real quick at the way the worker starts. Now, before I jump into that, I want to look real quick. We looked at on refresh. This is kind of normally I would start a work request, which is what we've done before, is a one-time work request. So one-time work request is just do this once, report back to me. Get me the answer. But a periodic work request, which is what I'm setting up, is going to go check on a periodic basis for new data. And so a periodic work manager, anytime you set up a work request, when you set up a periodic work request, you have to provide an interval. Okay, so an interval of how long do you want it to be between each time the work request runs. So the place that we find this app and where it sets it up repeated is in the application. So in the application, I say in queue workers. So I'm starting this anytime the application starts. So I'm going to call enqueue workers. And so my enqueue workers here method, the important part here is when I say, let's say, first of all, kind of walking through a few things. I do have some constraints because I want to only run this when the device is connected to the internet. So here I'm saying set required network type connected. So connected, it can be either, this can go over cellular, it can go over Wi-Fi. I don't care what kind of network it goes over. It just needs to be connected. If, on the other hand, maybe I was pulling down a lot of data, and a lot of games do this, especially when you're initially installed, you may want to pick one of the other options. So connected just says it can be any kind of network. Metered says I only want to do this on like cellular network where I'm being charged based on data usage. Or unmetered would be Wi-Fi because you're not charged based on data usage on most Wi-Fi. Does that make sense?
yeah.
So basically metered is typically cellular, unmeters is typically Wi-Fi. Now there's some gotchas there. So for instance, can you think of a case where your Wi-Fi might be metered?
If you're in a vehicle, like new vehicles have Wi-Fi that's metered.
Okay. Like they have a Wi-Fi hotspot built in?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you might have a Wi-Fi hotspot. You might also have there's still physical hotspots that you can get where, you can get, basically you put a SIM card in it and now you can get Wi-Fi. But those are typically charged per usage. Actually, I will say that sometimes that's actually for places that are disconnected from or kind of out in the country a little bit. Sometimes those hotspots are actually a really good deal because oftentimes you can get high-speed internet over a hotspot where you can't get it where your other option for wired is dial-up. So sometimes that's one thing that you'll see out in the country is people use hotspots as their regular internet. This also happens in Europe. Most internet in Europe is metered as well. So you might see hotspots, or you might be, another way you can do this is you can actually turn your phone into a hotspot, and we call that, everybody heard the term tethering?
Yeah.
So tethering, you would be on Wi-Fi, like your device, your laptop's connected to your phone, but your phone, because your phone is a metered connection, inherently that hotspot connection is also a metered connection. Does that make sense? So metered and unmetered is not actually technically Wi-Fi versus cellular. Is everybody with me there? They're not synonymous. So what we usually say, let's say this is a lot of data we want to download. Maybe we want to download a lot of data. We might say, well, let's only do this recurring task on an unmetered network. So we're not charging the user's data every 15 minutes. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sort of off on a little bit of a tangent. Is there any way to tell an Android device that it has an unlimited data connection so apps don't freak out because they're on the cellular network?
There's not. You can't tell how it's built. There's no way to tell that in Android. So because there's no way to tell that in code, what apps end up having to do is you have to put a switch into your app and say, go ahead and do this on cellular. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You make it a setting. So if you look at a lot of popular apps, Facebook included, and a lot of games, they may say it's okay to download large data on a cellular network. Oftentimes they'll have a switch for that. And so you just flip that switch, and then they'll basically change how they schedule their workers. They'll schedule it for connected instead of scheduling it for unmetered. Does that make sense? So oftentimes this is controlled by a setting. So I'm going to go back to connected here. So that's one of those things to think about. That does have a big difference. That can have a big effect on your users, what they get charged in terms of their data. That one decision there, connected versus unmetered. I don't honestly know why there is a metered section here. I don't understand why that's even there, because I don't know why you would want to set up a worker that only runs on a metered connection. So that would be a very, very unusual case. So we set up the constraints and then the periodic work request. So I'm going to be a periodic work request builder instead of one-time work request builder. And I still need to provide it a class. That's the same as a one-time work request. But with a periodic work request, you have to provide 2 additional values. So one is the interval, how big is the interval? So here I'm saying 15, and then the time unit. So I say 15 minutes is my window. Now, there is a restriction on the minimum length of that interval. It's honestly not very well documented by Android stuff by Google, but it does exist. So there is a minimum 15 minutes here. That is very hard to find in their documentation, but it is the case. If you set less than 15 minutes, you are not, there's no guarantee, and you likely won't get it. It will probably wait 15 minutes anyway. Okay? So, for instance, if I set this to 5 minutes, it still doesn't run every 5 minutes. It still only runs every 15 minutes for me. Is everybody with me there?
Yeah.
So what that means is these periodic jobs, again, the periodic jobs, you can't run them any more often than that. The reason that they chose that as a minimum is going back to this idea of they're trying to save battery. They're trying to make your user's battery last longer. And basically, if you turn on the radio, whether it be the Wi-Fi radio or the cellular radio, it's about 5 minutes from when you turn it on to when it turns off itself. So if you're trying to do something, a network call every 5 minutes, then the radio actually never gets to go to sleep fully. So that eats up a lot of battery. So, there's a big difference in having this every 2 hours versus having it every 5 minutes. That, you want to have a longer window there if you can. So that's just something to keep in mind. You're not going to be able to get this less than 15. It's also worth keeping in mind it's not guaranteed in any way, shape, or form that it will be that 15, which is I think what what we were talking about with Paul. You were seeing it at a much more random interval.
Yeah, it wasn't that bad though. It was doing it.
Yeah.
I think the longest interval was like maybe 4 minutes, but usually it was somewhere between 30 seconds and 2 minutes.
Okay, but 15 minutes is the lowest you're allowed to go typically. So I wouldn't set it less than that. There's a lot of threads out there on Stack Overflow and other places that have determined that is the lowest reliable interval. It very likely will be longer than that. So having a 20-minute, if you set it as 15, it very well maybe go to 20, because it's also a question of it has to wait potentially until other workers are done or other things are done before it can, or the radio is available for it to get to do things. Because one of the things that it tries to do is it tries to, if the radio's on, take advantage of that and do a bunch of requests all at once. So the radio can be on for the shortest amount of time. Paul?
So can only one thing use the radio at a time?
Multiple things can use the radio at one time. It depends, but that does depend a little bit on how the radio is set up. Because different devices have different numbers of antennas. So, for instance, you may have in a single device, you may have a Wi-Fi antenna, a 3G antenna, a 4G antenna, and a 5G antenna. Those are often separate antennas.
Can a phone, or can a device use more than one of those network antennas at the same time?
Yes, it can. It can. But each of them consume battery. So you want to have as many of those as possible. You want to have them turned off. Does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, there's a lot of low-level hardware stuff there you can read up on how that works. But yeah, most phones have multiple antennas in them, and they can kind of be operating at the same time. Even if they can't be operating exactly at the, like two things can't be operating exactly at the same time, they're interleaved so quickly that from your perspective, it typically looks like there's multiple things communicating over them at the same time. So it's a little bit depends on the arrangement of the antenna. So you might have two 4G antennas that are both communicating, but there's also kind of weird things where for performance standpoint, oftentimes there's like multiple 4G antennas and they'll all be shooting out the radio signal but in different directions. So you might have 4 different antennas, but they're all pointing in different directions. And so basically the first one that gets to the tower is the one that ends up getting used, kind of thing. Or you may send data on all 4 of them and then just kind of coalesce all of them when they get there. So there's a lot of complexity in the hardware there. Anyway, Paul, you had a question there?
Yeah, I kind of answered, but I got something that's pretty easy. I think you're going to talk about it next. Line 71, set initial delay, 1 second.
Yep.
Well, okay.
That's not required. I'm just showing you that that's an option.
An option, set initial delay. So the thing kicks off and then...
So the initial delay says, how long do I want to wait before the first time this runs? And so if you don't set an initial delay, it will try to run it immediately if it can. And so by setting a 1 second, I'm saying, well, wait at least 1 second before you start this.
Is it to allow other stuff to load? I'm trying to see what the value of running right away, it's presumably 0 seconds versus a second later, what that would do.
So if I didn't do this, then maybe the UI wouldn't be up and on screen by the time the worker finished.
Oh, okay, so it's loading, basically.
Yeah, so I'm giving that initial delay here gives the UI a second to get up on screen before I do my thing.
All right, and that's more than enough time. 1 second.
Yeah, that's enough time for this. Usually what I will do though, usually I will set the initial delay to the same as the period, because usually I don't want it to go for the first period. So if the period is every hour, I will usually set the initial delay as an hour as well, because I usually don't want the worker to go the first time. Does that make sense? So it can be a lot of different things. 1 second is one way to do it if you just have a relatively short boot up for your device. If my boot up was longer...
Did your audio cut?
Huh? I don't think it did. Did it?
Yeah, it seemed to.
Okay. So 1 second here is just to get it set up, is just to get the UI set up. If I had something more complicated, like I maybe need to read files and do a bunch of other stuff for the UI to be on screen, I would probably take a longer interval. But honestly, what I usually end up doing is I set this initial delay to the same as the interval. Does that make sense? So usually what I would do is, well, this is a 15-minute interval, so I'll make this a 15-minute interval. Or this is a 2-hour interval, so this will be a 2-hour interval.
Okay, it's not so critical. I mean, it could be 15 hours. It doesn't matter. It'll still run.
Yeah, it doesn't matter so much, but there usually should be an initial delay.
Okay,
Generally
1
speaking.
second. That'll do it. I get the reason.
Yeah. That leads you to less bugs. Yeah, so I do that, and then I just need to say in queue periodic work, and I give it the name of the job and replace and watch fortune request. So if there already was a job, I'm just going to replace that job with the new one. That's it. You know, the biggest thing to watch there is that people make the assumption that if I set an interval there, that's going to be guaranteed, and that's not. The interval's not guaranteed. That's just kind of like, here's roughly the interval I would like. But this could easily be, you know, if I say 15 minutes, it could be every 10 to 30 minutes, depending on what else is going on the device.
Yeah, it's not so critical. I mean, it'll get done. It won't take like 15 hours for sure.
Because my goal here is just basically to say, hey, there's new data, and if I'm close enough, then it's good, right? If I'm close enough to say there's new data, I can be off by even an hour and no big deal.
Okay, line 76. Is that always going to be replaced with periodic work that's unique?
Pretty much. I would say replace is usually the one you want over keep.
Yeah, because it clears the queue out, right? If there's something already there. Or...
It says take whatever job you had scheduled up previously and replace it. The catch is if you put it as keep, well, then it's keeping the thing that was already there. So it might be the job that you set up in a previous version of the app. So by having replace, I know that I'm running the current version of the code, not an old version of the code.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I might change my constraints. Like I might change from connected to unmetered. I might change the window. I might change the initial seconds, initial delay. I want to make sure that all of those new things are there. So replace is going to cancel whatever's running if it's running and put in the new thing. So that's a lot better for testing. Okay. Does that help point people to the right direction for setting this up for the lab? Because you'll be monitoring your APIs for new data.
Yeah, this is by far, among the other ones, the prime, I forget the names of the other ones, but this is like the example I need to move forward. The only thing I can handle it with you offline is the just input data. I just want to make sure I handle that the right way, because this is just pulling from the API. There's no, it's a void, There's
Yeah.
no inputs.
Yeah, there's no inputs to this, so.
Yeah, but I have inputs, and
Right.
it's caused me to call into question the interface that I have too.
Right. Well, the way that, I mean, part of the, I will say for everybody, part of the, if you've got inputs, they're going to end up here, right? They're going to end up part of the URL. If you have inputs, they're going to end up here. It's just a question of how you get them from where they are to here is not going to be the same for everybody. Is not going to be the same for every application. So that's why I'll talk to you on that separately, because that doesn't look the same way for everybody.
Yeah, that seems like some sort of business logic you'd want to have outside of the do work. Yeah.
Yeah. It usually isn't in the do work itself.
Is it typically done in the activity then? Is there a typical done place? I know it's different for each case, but where is it normally?
The part for the workers, it's going to be in here.
Okay.
Where you get the input data, it's going to be stuff that you do in the constructor. And so if you're pulling it in from the parameters, you might pull it in from here, or you might be pulling it in from the data source. Either way. And so it could be either of those pathways. If you look at the prime numbers one that we did, we'll actually see that I'm pulling in some input data there. So if I open there, see, current and max are effectively inputs in the prime numbers one. Those are both effectively inputs into the worker.
Okay, and you would put the stuff, the data, which would come from the interface. The user enters that, and then within the activity, you would put it in the data source, and then you would use the getter.
Exactly.
Here.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I would put it into the data source from the activity, and then I would pull it out here in the constructor.
Okay.
Cool.
Yeah, I got to work through it to get it, but I mean that helps a little bit. Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody else here before we call it a day and send you off?
Yeah. So the rest of the week we got the 3 days for the hands-on test, which we'll get Wednesday morning.
Yep. Planning to get you that Wednesday morning.
Wednesday morning, okay. And then we've got 2 homeworks, multiple choice things that are due on.
Yes.
I think that's tomorrow night. I think.
Yeah. And I think you have a reading assignment on perusal as well. If I remember right. I think some people have already done that. But 8.1 notification is your reading assignment there. And yes, on the inside Ranken, you have, I think, a homework to do.
Yeah, some of those fill in the blank ones. What do you just look at that and then say, yeah, that's right? Because it's, kind of like not so black or white. I did the 7.1 one. I didn't turn it in yet, but it looked like it was like fill in the blank, and you're just going to have to manually do those.
Yeah, let me take a look at it. So you've got the perusal reading, you've got homework questions. Yeah, so there's the homework for lesson 7 is due tomorrow, as well as the homework for lesson 8 is due tomorrow. You're asking about 7.1.
Yeah, I didn't look at 8 yet, but there's a few questions where you got to type it in. I don't know if you're just looking for code or, like the progress bar, for example. I was thinking that would probably be, they're usually multiple choice. Yeah. But it seems like there's no way to know whether that's right or not unless you open it and then say, yeah, that's right or that's not right.
So if you see something that is a short answer or a long answer, like this is a short answer, see just a single field, or there's this form, which is a long answer. Both of those are things are always grade manually. Just fair forewarning, just so you know.
Yeah.
Like those are always things that I look at the specific answer that everybody gave and I determine yes or no. I don't trust the auto grading to determine that for me. So If I'm looking at this one for progress bar, how do you determine the range of values the progress bar can show? So I'm looking for code, and note that I've asked this as a long answer, right?
Yeah, you're looking for code. You're not looking for a typed explanation.
Well, I'm looking for both, actually. I'm looking for code and a typed explanation. So because I've opened that up as a long answer, what I'm actually saying is I want you to answer, if you're in your mind, you see that there's two questions, answer both questions.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
Because there's actually two questions there. How do you determine the range? That's actually not just one question. Does that follow?
Yeah, I understand what you mean.
Because even code, right, how could you determine the range? Well, there's XML and there's Java. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. That.
So you could do this. You could do this in XML, or you could do it in Java. And this one, how much you turn the process bar is filled? Well, that could be XML. It could be Java. So I'd like the answer to both. And so async task, that makes sense. So what's that doing? Background, progress. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I need to pull this question off, actually. Because I meant to remove the ones about the loader, but apparently I didn't. Okay. So questions 10 through 13 I actually need to take off of here.